There are few sieges in the grim annals of the 31st millennium more catastrophic than what the Siege of Terra became. What should have been the swift or decisive blow to end the Horus heresy transformed instead into something far more terrible. A century of unending war that consumed not just armies, but entire generations. The very nature of warfare itself would be forever changed by what began in the orbital space above Terra on the 1st of Primus, 014.M31. The traitor fleets had broken through the outer system defenses as planned. Battlefleet Solar lay shattered in the void, its proud vessels reduced to burning wreckage that drifted like funeral pyres around Luna's captured bulk. Horus stood triumphant aboard the bridge of the vengeful spirit, his eyes fixed upon the blue jewel of Terra that hung before him like a prize waiting to be claimed. The War Master's plan was simple, brutal, and proven. Overwhelming force applied with surgical precision would crush the Loyalist defenders within days, perhaps weeks at most. Yet Perturabo, Primarch of the Iron Warriors, gazed upon the same sight and saw not opportunity, but folly. Where Horus saw a world ripe for conquest, the master of siege warfare saw the most fortified planet in human history. Every mountain had been carved into a fortress. Every valley bristled with defensive batteries. The imperial palace itself sprawled across continents, its walls rising higher than the peaks of ancient Terra's greatest mountains. This was not a city to be taken by storm. This was a world that would devour armies. The Iron Ring began to take shape 3 days into what the chronicles would call the Siege of Terra. Perturabo's vision was not of conquest, but of containment. If Terra could not be taken swiftly, then it would be held. If the Loyalists would not surrender quickly, then they would starve slowly. The Iron Warriors moved with methodical precision, constructing orbital fortress stations that ringed Terra's gravity, well like the segments of some vast mechanical crown. Each station was a marvel of defensive architecture, bristling with macro cannons and torpedo tubes, protected by void shields that could withstand the fury of a battle barge's full broadside. More importantly, each station was positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire with its neighbors, creating kill zones through which no ship could pass. The blockade was not merely military, but mathematical. Perturabo had solved the equation of siege warfare on a planetary scale. Horus raged when he realized what his brother was building. The War Master's fury blazed across the fleet communications as he demanded to know why Perturabo was constructing permanent fortifications instead of pressing the attack. "You build walls where we should be breaking them, brother," Horus thundered, his voice carrying the authority of one who had conquered hundreds of worlds. "Terra lies before us, wounded and bleeding. Now is the time to strike, not to sit idle in the void, constructing monuments to your own obsessions." Perturabo's response was delivered with the cold precision of an artillery barrage, calculated to the decimal. "You see a wounded beast, War Master. I see a fortress that has had 10,000 years to prepare for this moment. Every day we delay an orbital bombardment, dawn strengthens his defenses. Every hour we spend in fruitless assault, our ammunition reserves dwindle. You would have us dash ourselves against those walls like waves against a breakwater. I would have us be the tide that rises slowly, inevitably, until even the highest ramparts are submerged." The Iron Cage, as the Loyalists would come to call it, was completed within 6 months. By then it was too late for either side to change course. Perturabo's orbital fortresses commanded the high ground of space itself, their guns trained not only on Terra's surface, but on any vector of approach or escape. The Loyalist fleet that remained after the initial battle found itself trapped in Terra's gravity well, unable to break through the Iron Ring's overlapping fields of fire. They could not flee. They could not be reinforced. They could only endure. Rogel Dawn stood upon the walls of the imperial palace and watched the stars disappear behind the growing constellation of enemy fortifications. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists understood siege warfare as well as any being alive, save perhaps for his bitter rival, who now constructed their prison in the void above. Dawn's jaw tightened as he recognized the genius of Perturabo's strategy. This would not be the war any of them had prepared for. How long? The question came from Sanguinius, whose golden hair caught the dying light of Terra's sun as it set behind the orbital blockade. The Blood Angels Primarch had arrived just in time to witness the completion of their encirclement, his fleet barely slipping through the last gap before Perturabo sealed it forever. Dawn's response carried the weight of terrible certainty. Years, brother. Perhaps decades. Perturabo has turned this into a siege of attrition, and in such contests, time itself becomes the enemy. He paused, his eyes tracking the movement of distant fortress stations as they adjusted their positions with mechanical precision. He means to starve us out, to break our will through hunger, disease, and despair rather than honest battle. The first supply shortages began within months. Terra's vast population, swollen with refugees from across the galaxy, consumed resources at a rate that even the planet's massive agri-complexes could not sustain indefinitely. Rationing was implemented with military efficiency, but even the Emperor's own foresight had not prepared for a siege measured in years, rather than weeks. In the orbital fortresses above, the traitor legions faced their own supply challenges. The Iron Warriors had constructed their stations for permanence, but even Perturabo's genius could not conjure sustenance from the void. Supply runs became increasingly dangerous affairs as loyalist forces adapted to the new reality of siege warfare. Every transport that approached Terra ran a gauntlet of defensive fire that claimed more vessels with each passing month. Perturabo watched it all from the bridge of his flagship, the Iron Blood, which had been integrated into the largest of his orbital fortresses. The Primarch of the Iron Warriors showed no satisfaction at the success of his strategy, only the grim acknowledgement of mathematical certainty. This siege would consume them all, loyalist and traitor alike, in a furnace of prolonged warfare that would burn for longer than anyone yet dared to imagine. Yet that was precisely what he had intended, for Perturabo understood what his brothers did not. Some wars could not be won, only endured. Some victories could only be achieved through the total transformation of those who fought them. The siege of Terra would remake them all, or it would destroy them in the attempt. The iron cage tightened its grip, and the century of war began. 10 years into the siege, the war had settled into rhythms that no one had anticipated. The initial fury of orbital bombardment had given way to something far more insidious. A grinding, methodical campaign of attrition that measured progress not in kilometers gained, but in tons of supplies denied. The iron cage had transformed the greatest military conflict in human history into a contest of endurance, and endurance was reshaping everyone trapped within its embrace. Horus paced the strategium of the vengeful spirit like a caged predator, his massive frame casting shadows across tactical displays that showed minimal change from day to day. The War Master's frustration blazed in his eyes as he studied reports of incremental gains and losses that meant nothing in the greater scope of the siege. This was not the war he had envisioned when he turned against his father. This was not the swift conquest that would crown him emperor of mankind. 10 years, Perturabo, Horus growled, his voice carrying the weight of divine authority, strained by prolonged disappointment. 10 years of your methodical siege, and still Terra stands defiant. My brothers grow restless. The Emperor still lives. The Imperium still endures beyond our reach. Perturabo did not look up from his calculations, his augmented fingers tracing supply lines and ammunition expenditures across hollow-ithic displays. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had aged in ways that went beyond the mere passage of time. His features had grown sharper, more angular, as if the decade of siege warfare had carved away everything soft or merely human. Your brothers lack patience, War Master. This is not a war to be won in a single battle, but in 10,000 small victories. Every day Terra remains cut off from resupply is a victory. Every civilian that dies of starvation weakens Dawn's resolve. The evacuation of Terra's outer districts had begun in the 3rd year of the siege. Massive populations that had swelled the planet's numbers during the early days of the heresy found themselves slowly starving as food production failed to match consumption. The first evacuations were orderly affairs, conducted with the efficiency that marked all Imperial operations. By the 7th year, they had become desperate flights from sectors where order was breaking down entirely. Jagatai Khan watched the latest convoy of refugees from the walls of the Katabatic Plains. The Primarch of the White Scars had adapted his legion's tactics with the same fluid grace that marked their combat doctrine. Where once they had been masters of the lightning assault across open ground, they had become ghosts in the labyrinthine tunnel systems that now honeycombed Terra's surface. Hit-and-run warfare in the confines of siege trenches and underground supply routes. The people suffer while we play at war, the Khan said to his lieutenant, Chinsar, who stood beside him, observing the stream of displaced civilians. The refugees moved in endless columns toward the more secure inner districts, their faces marked by the hollow-eyed look of those who had lived too long with too little. Chinsar's response carried the pragmatic wisdom that marked the White Scars' approach to warfare. They adapt, as do we all, my Khan. The strong survive. The weak serve the strong in other ways. This is the nature of siege. Yet adaptation came at costs that no one had calculated. In the orbital fortresses above, the first generation of Iron Warriors who had constructed the siege works were showing signs of wear that went beyond physical fatigue. These were Space Marines, genetically enhanced warriors designed to fight for centuries without rest. But even superhuman physiology had limits when subjected to the unending stress of siege warfare measured in decades rather than seasons. The underground networks that supplied Terra's defenders had grown into cities unto themselves. What had begun as emergency supply routes had evolved into vast subterranean complexes where entire populations lived in permanent twilight. Factories hummed in converted subway tunnels. Hydroponic farms stretched through maintenance corridors that had been expanded into agricultural zones. Children who had been born in the early years of the siege were now approaching adolescence without ever seeing natural sunlight. Rogel Dawn stood in what had once been the Terran Senate chamber, now converted into a command center for the siege's defensive operations. The walls displayed a 3-dimensional map of Terra's surface and subsurface networks, a web of defensive positions and supply lines that had grown more complex with each passing year. The Primarch of the Imperial Fists had always been a master of defensive warfare, but this siege had demanded innovations that pushed even his genius to its limits. "We are becoming something new," Dawn said to Captain Archimus, his equerry, who reviewed reports of the latest adaptations to their defensive network. "This is no longer the Imperium we swore to defend. It is something forged in the crucible of permanent siege." The observation carried weight that went beyond military strategy. Terra's population had indeed transformed under the pressure of prolonged warfare. Civilian manufacturing had been entirely converted to military production. Every citizen had been trained in some form of combat role, whether as part of local defense militias or as support personnel for the Space Marines. Children learned to identify the sound of different artillery shells before they learned to read. The elderly were organized into intelligence networks that could track the movement of individual shells through the city-sized complex of the Imperial Palace. In the void above, Perturabo's siege machines had evolved as well. The Iron Warriors had become masters of a new form of warfare, one that required not just tactical brilliance, but logistical genius. Supply ships moved between orbital fortresses in patterns that had become as ritualized as religious ceremonies. Every bolt shell was accounted for. Every drop of fuel was calculated against strategic objectives that might not be achieved for years. The traitor legions faced their own transformation under the pressure of extended siege. The World Eaters, bred for close assault and rapid conquest, found their berserker nature poorly suited to the methodical patience that siege warfare demanded. Angron's sons grew increasingly unstable as years passed without the release of proper combat. Their battle lust turned inward, creating discipline problems that required constant attention from their officers. The Death Guard adapted more successfully to siege conditions. Mortarian's sons had always been masters of endurance warfare, and the grinding nature of the iron cage suited their temperament. They became the siege's enforcers, the legion called upon when other traitor forces showed signs of breaking under the prolonged stress. Sanguinius felt the changes most acutely of all the loyalist Primarchs, the Blood Angels. Primarch possessed a psychic sensitivity that made him acutely aware of his son's emotional state, and what he sensed in them troubled him deeply. The red thirst that had always lurked within his gene line was growing stronger under the stress of prolonged siege. His warriors fought with increasing savagery as the years passed, their noble nature slowly eroded by the unending cycle of violence. The angel stood upon the highest tower of the Imperial Palace and gazed up at the stars, or what few could be seen through the constellation of enemy fortress stations that now dominated Terra's sky. His golden hair moved in the recycled air that had replaced Terra's natural atmosphere in many sectors of the siege zone. Even here, in the heart of the Emperor's domain, the war was changing the fundamental nature of existence. "We are all becoming something darker," Sanguinius whispered to the night, his words carried away by artificial winds. "This siege is not just changing our tactics or our strategies, it is changing our souls." By the 10th year, both sides had developed technologies that had never existed before the siege began. The Loyalists had perfected underground manufacturing techniques that could produce ammunition and equipment in conditions that would have been impossible during peacetime. The traitors had created new forms of orbital bombardment that could sustain fire for months without depleting their ammunition stores. Yet the most significant change was not technological, but psychological. A generation of warriors on both sides had known no life except siege warfare. They understood war not as a temporary disruption of peaceful existence, but as the natural state of the universe. For them, the siege was not an aberration to be endured until victory could be achieved. It was simply the way things were. Perturabo understood this transformation better than any of his brothers. As he stood in his private chambers aboard the Iron Blood, surrounded by technical specifications for siege works that would not be completed for another decade, he allowed himself a moment of cold satisfaction. The siege was proceeding exactly as he had calculated, not toward victory in any conventional sense, but toward the creation of something entirely new. The war had become self-sustaining. It fed on itself, growing stronger with each passing year rather than weaker. Both sides were now committed to a conflict that had transcended its original purpose. They fought not for Terra, or for the Emperor, or even for Horus. but because fighting was all they knew how to do. And in that transformation, Perturabo had achieved something that no military genius before him had ever accomplished. He had created a war that could not end, because ending was no longer a concept that any of the participants could truly comprehend. The 7th year of the siege brought with it a madness that had been building in the void between Terra and its orbital prison. Horus could no longer endure the methodical pace of Perturabo's war. The War Master's patience, never his greatest virtue, had been ground away by years of incremental gains and losses that meant nothing in the face of Terra's continued defiance. He demanded action, not as a strategic necessity, but as a psychological release from the mounting pressure of prolonged stalemate. Angron heard that call and answered it with the fury that defined his existence. The Primarch of the World Eaters had spent 7 years watching his sons slowly consume themselves with frustrated bloodlust. They were warriors bred for close combat and rapid conquest, not the methodical patience that siege warfare demanded. Each passing month had seen discipline within the Legion deteriorate further, until even Angron's iron control could barely contain their need for violence. The assault on the Saturnine Wall began at dawn on the 13th of Quartus, though dawn had become a meaningless concept in the perpetual twilight of Terra's besieged atmosphere. The World Eaters' drop pods screamed through the orbital defense grid like meteors of fury, their hulls glowing with the heat of atmospheric entry and the blessings of the blood god who had begun to whisper promises in their ears. Rogel Dawn watched the incoming assault from his command post in the Saturnine Wall's central tower. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had spent the intervening years transforming the wall into something that transcended mere fortification. It had become a work of defensive art, every angle calculated to channel attacking forces into predetermined kill zones, every rampart designed to maximize the effectiveness of defensive fire while minimizing the attacker's ability to find cover. "They come in their thousands," observed Captain Archimus, studying the tactical displays that showed the scale of the World Eaters' assault. The screens painted a picture of overwhelming force applied with berserker intensity against carefully prepared positions. Dawn's response carried the grim satisfaction of an architect whose design was about to be tested. Let them come. The wall has been waiting for this moment. Every stone knows its purpose. Every gun has been sighted for maximum effect. Angron brings fury, but fury without discipline is merely waste. The first wave of World Eaters struck the outer defenses with a violence that shook the foundation stones of the Saturnine Wall. Chain axes carved through ceramite and flesh with equal ease as Angron's sons threw themselves into the killing grounds that Dawn had so carefully prepared. They advanced not as soldiers following a tactical plan, but as avatars of pure aggression, seeking only to come to grips with their enemies. Yet for every meter they gained, the cost mounted exponentially. The Imperial Fists had spent 7 years perfecting their defensive doctrine, and every lesson learned in smaller skirmishes had been incorporated into the wall's design. Overlapping fields of fire created zones where even space marine armor could not provide adequate protection. Carefully positioned demolition charges collapsed sections of the wall onto the attackers, only to reveal secondary positions that had been concealed behind the rubble. Angron himself led the deepest penetration, his massive form cutting through defensive positions like a living engine of destruction. The Red Angel had grown more bestial in the years since the siege began, his features twisted by the constant whispers of Khorne that had grown stronger as the war progressed. Where he walked, the very ground seemed to thirst for blood, and his presence drove his sons to ever greater heights of savagery. The Primarch of the World Eaters carved a path of devastation through 3 defensive lines before meeting resistance that even his superhuman strength could not immediately overwhelm. Sanguinius had positioned himself at the wall's heart, knowing that if Angron broke through the outer defenses, only another Primarch would have any hope of stopping his advance. The duel between the two brothers took place in a courtyard that had been designed as a killing ground, surrounded by overlapping fields of fire from defensive positions that could no longer be safely used while the Primarchs fought. Sanguinius moved with the grace that had always marked his combat style, his bladework flowing like a deadly dance as he sought to turn Angron's fury against itself. Yet the angel was not the warrior he had been at the siege's beginning. 7 years of constant warfare had worn at his noble spirit, leaving cracks through which darker impulses could seep. The red thirst that plagued his gene line had grown stronger under the stress of prolonged conflict, and he could feel it rising in his throat like a tide of crimson hunger. Angron sensed his brother's internal struggle and pressed his advantage with the cunning that lurked beneath his berserker exterior. "You feel it, don't you, my noble brother? The thirst for blood that makes a mockery of your pretensions to honor. How long before you become what I am? How long before the siege strips away your facade of righteousness?" The words struck deeper than any physical blow. Sanguinius knew the truth in them, could feel the darkness growing stronger within him with each passing day of violence. His sons looked to him for leadership, and found an angel slowly transforming into something far more terrible. The irony was not lost on him that in defending Terra's purity, he was allowing his own to be corrupted. Their battle raged for hours, neither brother able to gain decisive advantage over the other. Angron's fury was matched by Sanguinius's desperation to prove that nobility could still triumph over base savagery. Yet both were fighting not just their opponent, but their own inner demons. The siege had changed them all in ways that went beyond the merely physical. The breakthrough came not from either Primarch's efforts, but from an innovation that Dawn had been developing in secret. The Imperial Fists had spent years studying the wreckage of demon engines that had been destroyed in smaller engagements, learning their weaknesses and developing countermeasures. When Angron's assault reached its climax, Dawn unleashed his own demon engines. These were not the twisted amalgamations of flesh and metal that served chaos, but carefully controlled fusion of Imperial technology and captured warp entities. The results were abominations that served the Emperor's will while retaining the supernatural power that made demon engines so effective. They emerged from concealed positions within the wall itself, bringing firepower that could match anything the traitors had deployed. The sight of loyalist demon engines broke something fundamental in the attacking World Eaters. They had expected to face Imperial discipline and Imperial technology, not the same corrupt fusion of material and immaterial that they themselves employed. The cognitive dissonance shattered their charge as surely as any physical obstacle could have. Perturabo watched the assaults collapse from his orbital command post with the cold satisfaction of a mathematician whose equations had proven correct. He had predicted that any direct assault on Terra's prepared positions would fail, regardless of the fury behind it. The siege was a problem that could not be solved through application of greater force, but only through the slow erosion of the defenders' will to resist. "The World Eaters have learned a valuable lesson," he observed to his lieutenant, Forex, who stood beside him studying the tactical displays that showed Angron's forces withdrawing in disorder. "Fury without strategy is merely suicide by degrees. This assault has cost them more than they could afford to lose, and gained them nothing but a demonstration of their own limitations." The aftermath of the failed assault established patterns that would define the siege for decades to come. Massive offensives would be launched with great fanfare and seemingly overwhelming force, only to break against defenses that had been prepared with years of careful planning. The periods between assaults would be used by both sides to develop new technologies and tactics, creating an arms race that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in siege warfare. Angron's World Eaters never fully recovered from the losses they sustained at the Saturnine Wall. The Legion that had once been a byword for unstoppable assault became increasingly fragmented, their cohesion undermined by the realization that their greatest strength had proven useless against properly prepared defenses. They would continue to fight, but their effectiveness was permanently diminished. For the Imperial Fists, the successful defense of the Saturnine Wall became a template for future defensive operations. Dawn's innovations in siege architecture spread throughout Terra's defensive network, each position becoming more sophisticated and deadly as lessons learned in battle were incorporated into new construction. Yet the victory came at costs that went beyond the merely tactical. The deployment of loyalist demon engines had crossed a line that many within the imperial hierarchy had hoped would never be crossed. The decision to fight corruption with corruption, no matter how controlled, had implications that would echo throughout the siege and beyond. Sanguinius withdrew to his private chambers after the battle and stared at his reflection in polished adamantium. The face that looked back at him was still recognizably his own, but changed in subtle ways that spoke of the darkness growing within. His eyes held flecks of red that had not been there at the siege's beginning. His features bore lines of strain that marked the constant struggle to maintain his nobility in the face of endless violence. The angel understood that the siege was not just changing the nature of warfare, but the nature of those who fought it. Every day brought new compromises, new lines crossed in the name of necessity. He could feel himself becoming something darker, something that might better match the enemies they faced, but would be less worthy of the people they claimed to protect. In the depths of the imperial palace, the emperor remained seated upon the golden throne, his attention focused on psychic battles that dwarfed the physical conflict raging on Terra's surface. Yet even his vast consciousness was not immune to the siege's transformative power. Each day of prolonged warfare demanded more of his strength, more of his attention, more of his humanity. The siege had become a crucible in which all participants were being reforged, loyalist and traitor alike. The war that had begun as a conflict between brothers had evolved into something far more fundamental. It was becoming a test of what humanity could become when pushed beyond all reasonable limits, and the results were not always what any of them had hoped to find. 8 years into the siege, Jagatai Khan had grown tired of being a prisoner on his own homeworld. The Primarch of the White Scars was a creature of motion and freedom, bred for the lightning strike and the swift pursuit across open ground. To be trapped within Terra's fortified walls, no matter how well defended, was a torture that gnawed at his soul with each passing day. Yet the Khan was not merely a warrior. He was a strategist who understood that sometimes the most audacious plan was the only one worth attempting. The alliance had been forming in secret for months, built through coded transmissions and whispered conversations in the deepest tunnels beneath the imperial palace. Scattered loyalist fleet elements that had survived the siege's opening phase still operated beyond the Iron Ring, conducting hit-and-run raids against traitor supply convoys. They were few in number and constantly hunted, but they retained the most precious commodity in the siege zone: mobility. Admiral Kai Raffaella commanded one such group from the bridge of the strike cruiser Shadowhawk, a vessel that bore the scars of 8 years of running battles through the outer system. Her ship had become a ghost in the void, striking where least expected and vanishing before the traitors could bring their overwhelming numbers to bear. She had kept her crew alive through cunning and desperation in equal measure. But she knew that survival was not victory. For victory, they needed something more ambitious than mere resistance. The Khan's proposal had reached her through channels so secret that even now she was not entirely certain how the communication had been established. The plan was madness, but it was the kind of madness that might actually succeed where sanity had failed. A coordinated strike from within and without the Iron Ring, timed to exploit the brief window when Perturabo's orbital fortresses were most vulnerable. The White Scars had spent months studying the patterns of the siege station's movements. Even Perturabo's genius could not eliminate every inefficiency in a blockade that spanned an entire planetary system. There were moments, measured in minutes rather than hours, when the overlapping fields of fire that made the Iron Ring so effective created gaps through which a sufficiently swift and daring force might pass. Jagatai Khan stood in the war room beneath the katabatic plains and studied the hololithic display that showed the orbital dance of enemy positions. His staff officers surrounded him, each a master of the lightning warfare that defined their legion's character. They had adapted to siege conditions better than most, but adaptation was not the same as acceptance. They were still the sons of Chogoris, still the hunters of the open steppes, even if those steppes were now tunnels carved through Terra's bedrock. "The window will be narrow," observed Brotherhood Captain Torgun Khan, his weathered features marked by years of tunnel fighting. 7 minutes at most before the fortress stations adjust their positions to close the gap. 7 minutes to break a siege that has lasted 8 years. The Khan's response carried the fierce joy of a predator scenting prey after a long hunt. 7 minutes is a lifetime to those who move with purpose. The traitors have grown comfortable in their orbital fortress. They think of us as trapped prey, not as hunters waiting for our moment to strike. The assault began 3 hours before dawn, though dawn and dusk had become meaningless concepts beneath Terra's shrouded sky. The first phase was diversionary, a series of coordinated attacks against the Saturnine Wall and other major defensive positions. These were not intended to break through, but to draw attention and resources away from the orbital defenses that protected the Iron Ring's weakest point. Sanguinius led one such attack personally, his golden wings gleaming in the artificial light as he carved through traitor positions with controlled fury. The angel had grown darker in the months since Ongren's failed assault, his noble features marked by lines of strain that spoke of constant struggle against the red thirst. Yet he still fought with the grace that had always defined him, each movement a deadly dance of blade and wing. The diversions worked precisely as the Khan had calculated. Perturabo's attention turned toward the surface attacks, his analytical mind focused on determining whether these represented a genuine offensive or merely another futile gesture of defiance. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had grown accustomed to the rhythm of siege warfare, the alternating periods of violence and stalemate that marked the passage of years. In that moment of distraction, the Khan struck. White Scar's assault boats launched from concealed positions throughout the Imperial Palace, their trajectories carefully calculated to intersect with Admiral Raffaella's incoming fleet at the precise moment when the Iron Ring's coverage was weakest. The coordination required was breathtaking in its complexity, demanding split-second timing across multiple vectors of approach. The assault boats screamed through the gap in the orbital defenses like arrows loosed by a master archer. Each craft was loaded with the finest warriors the White Scars could provide, veterans of 8 years of siege warfare who understood that this might be their only chance to break free from their prison. They moved with the fluid grace that had always marked their legion's character, adapting their tactics to the three-dimensional battlefield of orbital space with the same instinctive skill they had once applied to the steppes of Chogoris. Admiral Raffaella's fleet emerged from the asteroid field where they had been concealed, their guns blazing as they engaged the outer perimeter of Perturabo's fortress network. The strike cruiser Shadowhawk led the charge, its battle-scarred hull gleaming with the fire of its weapon systems as it carved a path through the traitor defenses. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though 8 years of careful planning and desperate hope might be rewarded with success. The Khan himself rowed in the lead assault boat, his dhow gleaming in his hands as he prepared to board whatever enemy vessel presented itself as a target. This was warfare as it was meant to be fought, not the grinding attrition of siege lines, but the swift strike that could change the fate of worlds in a single decisive moment. He could feel the exhilaration of motion after years of enforced stillness, the joy of the hunt that had been denied him for too long. Yet Perturabo was not the only genius among the traitor Primarchs. Horus had been watching the diversionary attacks with the strategic instinct that had made him War Master, and he recognized the Khan's true purpose before the assault boats had cleared Terra's atmospheric envelope. The Lord of the Sons of Horus moved with the same lightning swiftness that the White Scars prided themselves upon, but applied to the realm of fleet command rather than personal combat. The Vengeful Spirit and its escort squadron broke from their positions around the orbital ring with an acceleration that spoke of machine spirits driven beyond their normal limits. Horus had recognized that this was not merely an escape attempt, but a challenge to his authority as commander of the siege. If the Khan succeeded in breaking through the blockade, it would prove that Perturabo's much-vaunted Iron Ring was not the impregnable barrier they had believed it to be. The space battle that followed lasted less than an hour, but it was conducted with an intensity that compressed the fury of years into minutes of desperate combat. The Khan's assault boats danced through the void like deadly birds, their pilots pushing their craft beyond all reasonable limits as they sought to complete their mission before the traitor response could overwhelm them. Admiral Raffaella's fleet provided covering fire with the precision of veterans who had learned their trade in the hardest possible school. For 27 minutes, victory seemed not just possible but inevitable. The Khan's forces had punched through the outer defenses and were approaching the gap that would allow them to break free from the system entirely. Loyalist reinforcements from beyond the blockade zone were already moving to support their breakthrough, ready to escort the evacuated forces to safety among the distant stars. Then Horus arrived. The War Master's personal intervention transformed the engagement from a calculated risk into a battle between gods. His flagship's guns spoke with authority that reduced lesser vessels to scrap and vapor, while his presence on the battlefield inspired the traitor forces to feats of desperate courage. The Sons of Horus fought with the skill that had made them the premier legion of the Great Crusade, their tactics adapted to the close-range brutality of fleet engagement. The Khan found himself forced into a duel he had hoped to avoid. His assault boat closed with one of the Vengeful Spirit's escort vessels, boarding actions erupting across multiple decks as White Scars and Sons of Horus settled their differences with blade and bolt. The confined spaces of a starship were not ideal terrain for the lightning warfare that the White Scars favored, but they adapted with the flexibility that had always marked their character. Yet adaptation could not overcome the fundamental mathematics of the engagement. Horus had arrived with overwhelming force, and the gap in the orbital defenses was already beginning to close as Perturabo's fortress stations adjusted their positions. The window of opportunity that had seemed so promising was narrowing with each passing moment, and the Khan was forced to make the hardest decision of his life. The withdrawal was conducted with the same precision that had marked the assault. The Khan recognized that to continue fighting would be to throw away lives for no purpose beyond pride. And pride was a luxury that besieged defenders could not afford. His assault boats disengaged from their targets and began the dangerous journey back to Terra's surface, harried by traitor fighters, but protected by the covering fire of Admiral Raffaella's increasingly desperate fleet. The Admiral herself did not survive the retreat. The Shadowhawk died, covering the withdrawal of the last assault boats, her crew fighting to the end as their ship was torn apart by the concentrated fire of multiple enemy vessels. Her sacrifice bought the time needed for the Khan's forces to reach the safety of Terra's defensive umbrella, but it also marked the end of organized loyalist resistance beyond the Iron Ring. Jagatai Khan stood once again in his command center, beneath the Katabatic plains, and stared at the tactical displays that showed the aftermath of his failed gambit. The gap in the orbital defenses had been sealed with new fortress stations, their positions calculated to ensure that no similar opportunity would ever arise again. The Iron Ring was now truly unbreakable, a mathematical certainty rather than merely a strategic probability. "We came closer than anyone had a right to expect," offered Torgun Khan, his voice carrying the weariness of a warrior who had seen hope die before his eyes. The plan was sound, the execution was flawless, yet still we remain trapped. The Khan's response carried the bitter wisdom of a hunter who had finally encountered prey beyond his ability to catch. "Closer is not close enough, old friend. We have learned the limits of audacity in the face of overwhelming force. Perturabo's cage is not merely strong, it is perfect. Every weakness we might have exploited has now been eliminated." In the depths of space, Horus stood on the bridge of the vengeful spirit and contemplated the implications of the Khan's failed escape attempt. The assault had come far closer to success than anyone in the traitor leadership had anticipated, and that proximity to disaster had uncomfortable implications for the siege's long-term stability. If the Loyalists could mount such a coordinated effort after 8 years of isolation, what might they achieve given more time to prepare? The War Master's response was swift and decisive. The remaining traitor legions were redistributed throughout the Iron Ring, their positions carefully calculated to ensure that no single point in the blockade would ever again be vulnerable to concentrated assault. The fortress stations were reinforced with additional weapon systems and void shields, their overlapping fields of fire adjusted to eliminate even the microscopic gaps that the Khan had exploited. More importantly, Horus reasserted his personal authority over the increasingly independent traitor legions. The siege had begun to develop its own momentum, with individual Primarchs pursuing their own agendas rather than following the coordinated strategy that had brought them to Terra's gates. The Khan's near success served as a sharp reminder that unity of command was not merely an administrative nicety, but a military necessity. By the end of the 8th year, Terra was more thoroughly isolated than it had ever been in its long history. The Iron Ring had evolved from a blockade into a cage, its bars forged from adamantium and mathematics rather than mere iron. No ship could approach without permission. No signal could escape without interception. The planet that had given birth to humanity's interstellar empire had become a prison from which there was no escape. The psychological impact of the failed breakout attempt was profound. For 8 years, the defenders of Terra had maintained hope that their isolation was temporary, that relief would eventually come from the loyal legions still fighting across the galaxy. The Khan's failure extinguished that hope as surely as a candle flame snuffed out by a hurricane wind. Yet in that darkest moment, something new began to emerge. If Terra could not be relieved from without, then its defenders would have to find strength from within. The siege was no longer a temporary crisis to be endured until rescue arrived. It was the new reality in which they would live and fight, and, if necessary, die. The recognition of that truth would prove to be more transformative than any military defeat. The iron cage was complete, and all who dwelt within it understood that they would live and die as prisoners unless they could find a way to break chains forged from the very fabric of space itself. 20 years into the siege, the war had consumed its own children and begun to birth new ones. The desperate urgency that had marked the first decade had given way to something far more insidious: acceptance. What had begun as a crisis to be endured had transformed into a way of life that shaped every aspect of existence within Terra's shrinking sphere of influence. The siege had become not merely a military operation, but a civilization unto itself. In the deepest tunnels beneath the imperial palace, children who had never seen unfiltered sunlight practiced weapons drills with the methodical precision of veterans. These were the siege-born, a generation that knew war not as an interruption of normal life, but as the natural state of existence. They learned to identify artillery shells by sound before they learned their letters, could strip and reassemble a laser gun before they could tie their boots, and spoke of the time before the siege as their grandparents might have spoken of mythology. Sergeant Mickle Thorne was one such child, though at 19 he was already a veteran of conflicts that had raged in the Undercity for half his lifetime. Born in the 3rd year of the siege to parents who served in the Imperial Army's Logistics Corps, he had grown to maturity in a world where recycling ammunition casings was as important as loading them. His face bore the pallor common to tunnel dwellers, but his eyes held the hardened gleam of someone who had never known peace. "The Emperor protects," he murmured, as he led his squad through the recycling warrens beneath Sector Septimus, the ritual words carrying different weight when spoken by those who had never known imperial protection as anything other than abstract concept. For the siege-born, the Emperor was not a liberator or conqueror, but simply the reason they fought in darkness against enemies they might never see. The recycling warrens represented one of the siege's most crucial innovations. Every bolt shell casing was recovered and reprocessed. Every piece of scrap metal was sorted and catalogued for potential reuse. The technology that maintained this vast operation had evolved far beyond what had existed before the siege began, driven by necessity into realms that pushed the boundaries of what imperial science had thought possible. Tech adept Corion 7 observed the recycling processes with the dispassionate interest that marked his kind. The siege had changed even the Mechanicus, forcing adaptations that their doctrine had never anticipated. The sacred principles of technology that had guided them for millennia had been forced to accommodate innovations that bordered on heretical, yet were essential for survival. Recycling was not merely practical, but had become a form of worship in its own right. "Every fragment serves the Omnissiah's will," Corion 7 intoned, as he blessed a batch of reclaimed adamantium that would be forged into new armor plating. "Nothing is waste. Everything has purpose. Even in siege, especially in siege, the machine endures." Yet the greatest transformation was taking place within the heart of the imperial palace itself. The Emperor's withdrawal to the Golden Throne had become increasingly complete with each passing year. What had begun as necessary focus on psychic warfare against the forces of chaos had evolved into something approaching total disconnection from the material realm. The Master of Mankind spoke less frequently with each passing season. His attention focused on battles that dwarfed even the siege in scope and significance. Captain General Constantin Valdor stood vigil outside the throne room, as he had for 20 years, watching for any sign that the Emperor might emerge to provide guidance to his beleaguered defenders. The custodian had seen empires rise and fall, but never had he witnessed anything like the slow transformation of Terra's heart. The Emperor remained physically present, but his consciousness roamed battlefields that existed beyond the reach of mortal understanding. "He fights for us still," Valdor said to Malcador the Sigillite, who had become the de facto ruler of the siege in the Emperor's absence. "The psychic barriers that protect us from demonic incursion require his constant attention. Yet I wonder if we are losing our father, even as we preserve our world." Malcador's response carried the weight of exhaustion that marked all who had endured 2 decades of siege. "We are all changing, Constantin. The question is whether we are changing into something worth preserving. The Emperor sees further than any of us. If his attention is elsewhere, it is because the threats we cannot see are greater than those we can." The first formal truces had begun in the 14th year, born not of military necessity, but of simple human decency. Even Space Marines could not fight continuously for decades without pause, and the mounting casualties from both sides created logistical problems that transcended ideology. The dead could not be left to rot in the contested zones without creating disease outbreaks that would affect both loyalist and traitor forces. The corpse truces, as they came to be called, were negotiated between field commanders who had been killing each other for more than a decade. These brief cessations of hostilities allowed for the removal of bodies, the treatment of wounded who might otherwise die needlessly, and the exchange of prisoners who had become more burden than asset to their captors. The truces were never formally acknowledged by higher command on either side, but they were tolerated as a necessary adaptation to the realities of prolonged warfare. Brother Sergeant Castaner of the Imperial Fists met his counterpart from the Iron Warriors in the ruins of what had once been a civilian hab block. The 2 Space Marines had been fighting each other for so long that they had developed a grudging professional respect that transcended their ideological differences. They knew each other's tactics, respected each other's competence, and understood that their personal enmity was less important than the practical requirements of siege warfare. "Your dead numbered 47 in Sector 12, Castaner reported with military precision. "Ours numbered 31. The wounded who cannot fight should be exchanged according to previous agreements." The Iron Warriors' response carried no trace of the fanatical hatred that had marked the siege's early years. "Agreed. The fever sickness in Subsector Gamma affects your forces as much as ours. Joint medical protocols should be established before it spreads further." Such conversations would have been unthinkable in the siege's first decade, but 20 years of attrition had taught lessons that ideology could not overcome. Enemies who fought each other every day could still recognize shared humanity in the face of challenges that transcended factional loyalty. Magnus the Red experienced the siege's psychological pressure differently than his brothers. The psychic maelstrom that raged around Terra affected him with particular intensity, bombarding his enhanced consciousness with emanations from the warp that grew stronger with each passing year. Where other Primarchs adapted to the siege through tactical innovation or technological advancement, Magnus found his sanity slowly eroded by forces that existed beyond physical reality. The Crimson King stood in his sanctum aboard his flagship, surrounded by texts that shifted and changed even as he read them. The knowledge that had once been his greatest strength had become a source of torment, as the siege's psychic emanations twisted his perception of reality. He could feel his consciousness fragmenting under the constant assault of warp energies that grew more intense with each passing month. "Truth becomes lie, becomes truth again," Magnus murmured to himself, his voice carrying harmonics that had not been present in earlier years. The siege is real, the siege is illusion. We fight ourselves. We fight shadows of ourselves. Time moves in circles here. Time stands still, The Emperor lies. The Emperor speaks truth. Both. Neither. All is dust in the end. His legion bond with the 1,000 Suns had begun to fracture as well, their psychic connection strained by the contradictory emanations that flowed from Terra's besieged surface. Some of his sons reported visions of victory, others of absolute defeat, and still others of conflicts that seemed to have no resolution whatsoever. The chapter that had once prided itself on clarity of thought found itself lost in a maze of possibilities that might all be equally true or false. The children born during the siege's second decade represented something entirely new in human history. They were not merely civilians who happened to live during wartime, but products of a society that had been entirely reorganized around the principles of permanent warfare. Their education focused on skills that would keep them alive in a siege environment. Their culture celebrated virtues that were useful in prolonged resistance. Their understanding of normal human existence was entirely theoretical. Cadet Commissar Elena Vasquez was 16 years old and had never known peace. Born to munitions workers in the 8th year of the siege, she had been selected for officer training based on aptitude tests that measured ability to maintain morale under impossible conditions. Her instructors were veterans who had fought in the siege from its beginning, and their lessons carried the weight of hard-won experience. "The siege is not our enemy," she recited along with her fellow cadets, their young voices echoing in the reinforced chambers that served as their classroom. "The siege is our teacher. It shows us who we truly are when everything else has been stripped away. We are the children of Terra, and Terra endures." Such indoctrination was necessary because the siege-born faced psychological pressures that their parents could barely comprehend. They lived their entire lives in artificial environments, breathed recycled air, ate processed food that bore little resemblance to natural nutrition, and maintained their sanity through adherence to routines that provided structure in a world that seemed to have no end or purpose beyond its own continuation. The technological innovations that sustained the siege had evolved into art forms in their own right. The recycling processes that had begun as crude expedients had been refined into precise sciences that extracted maximum utility from every scrap of available material. The hydroponic gardens that fed the population had become marvels of engineering that produced more food per square meter than had ever been achieved in human history. Yet perhaps the most significant innovation was social rather than technological. The siege had created new forms of human organization that transcended the traditional structures of imperial society. Guild-like associations formed around specific siege functions, creating communities that were defined by their role in the war effort rather than their place of birth or social class. These siege guilds became the fundamental organizing principle of life within Terra's walls, providing identity and purpose to populations that might otherwise have despaired. The Ammunition Guild controlled the production and distribution of weapons and ordnance. The Tunnel Guild managed the vast underground networks that allowed movement and communication throughout the siege zone. The Scrap Guild oversaw recycling operations that had become essential to survival. Each guild developed its own customs, its own traditions, and its own forms of internal governance that allowed them to function independently while contributing to the overall war effort. Master Scrivener Aldrich of the Records Guild understood the historical significance of what was taking place better than most. His responsibility was to document the siege's evolution for whatever posterity might exist after its conclusion. The records he maintained told the story of humanity's adaptation to circumstances that no previous generation had ever faced. "We are becoming something new," Aldrich noted in his daily observations, his stylus moving across parchment made from recycled materials. Not human in the sense that our ancestors would recognize, but not something else entirely. We are siege folk, a subspecies of humanity that exists nowhere else in the galaxy. Whether we represent evolution or devolution remains to be determined. By the end of the second decade, the siege had achieved a stability that would have seemed impossible in its chaotic early years. Both sides had adapted to their circumstances with remarkable thoroughness, creating systems and societies that could theoretically continue indefinitely. The war had not ended, but it had found equilibrium, a balance of opposing forces that might persist for generations to come. Yet equilibrium was not peace, and adaptation was not victory. The siege had consumed 2 decades of human life and transformed everyone it touched into something they had never intended to become. The children who played war games in Terra's tunnels would grow up to fight real wars in those same tunnels, continuing a cycle that had no clear endpoint beyond the exhaustion of all participants. The Emperor's silence had become a constant presence in itself, a void at the heart of imperial authority that shaped everything around it. His withdrawal was not merely physical, but metaphysical, leaving humanity to find its own way forward in circumstances that exceeded all previous experience. The siege had become humanity's teacher, its judge, and perhaps ultimately its heir. The plague ships descended through Terra's atmosphere like harbingers of the apocalypse, their hulls weeping toxins that turned the very air into an instrument of death. Mortarion had grown tired of the siege's endless stalemate, and the Lord of the Death Guard possessed weapons that transcended mere military strategy. If Terra could not be conquered through conventional assault, then it would be cleansed through the patient application of disease and decay. The Pale King stood in the plague laboratories aboard his flagship Endurance, watching his apothecaries complete their most terrible work. These were not the crude biological weapons that had been used in earlier conflicts, but diseases that had been specifically designed for the unique conditions of siege warfare. Pathogens that could survive in recycled air systems, toxins that could penetrate the most advanced filtration equipment, and viruses that fed on the very desperation that had sustained Terra's defenders for 3 decades. "Let them taste the gift of Grandfather Nurgle," Mortarion whispered, his voice carrying the wet rasp that marked those who had been touched by the Lord of Decay. "Let them understand that their defiance has earned them not death, but transformation into something more honest than what they were." The first outbreak occurred in Sector Mortis, one of the deep industrial complexes that had been converted to munitions production during the siege's early years. Workers who had labored in those depths for decades began to sicken with symptoms that defied every medical protocol the imperial authorities had developed. The plague was not merely virulent, but actively intelligent, adapting to each countermeasure almost before it could be implemented. Apothecary Samael of the Blood Angels found himself confronting diseases that challenged everything he understood about biological warfare. The pathogens were not content to simply kill their hosts, but sought to transform them into something that served the plague's own purposes. Those who succumbed became vectors for further transmission, their bodies continuing to function long after clinical death had occurred. "This is not natural disease," Samael reported to his Primarch through communications channels that had been sanitized with methods that bordered on the obsessive. "These plagues show clear signs of artificial design, but they adapt and evolve faster than anything we have encountered. It is as if the diseases themselves possess intelligence." Sanguinius received the report in his command chamber, where he had been studying casualty figures that grew more dire with each passing hour. The Angel had spent 30 years learning to fight enemies that could be defeated with blade and bolt, but the Death Guard's latest weapon required skills that he had never been forced to develop. Yet the suffering of his people demanded action, regardless of his own limitations. "Then we will learn," Sanguinius declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who had never accepted defeat as an option. "If this plague possesses intelligence, then it can be outwitted. If it adapts to our countermeasures, then we will adapt faster. We will not allow our people to die in agony while we stand paralyzed by the novelty of our enemy's methods." The response required alliances that would have been unthinkable in peacetime. The hive gangs that controlled Terra's deepest underground networks possessed knowledge of toxic environments that even the Mechanicus had never catalogued. These were criminals and outcasts who had survived in conditions that killed normal humans, and their expertise became essential for understanding how the plague spread through Terra's complex infrastructure. Gang Lord Vex Korath met with Imperial commanders in circumstances that violated every protocol the Imperium had established for dealing with criminal elements. Yet the plague made no distinction between loyal citizens and outcasts, and survival required pragmatic alliances that transcended ideological purity. Korath's people knew every tunnel, every ventilation shaft, every hidden pathway that could serve as a vector for disease transmission. "Your fancy air scrubbers mean nothing down in the deep hives," Korath explained to the assembled Imperial officers, his scarred face reflecting years of exposure to industrial toxins. "The air down there has been killing people since before your siege began. We know how to live in poison because we've never had any choice. Your plague-touched sky might be new to you, but it's just another day for those of us who were already dying slowly." The quarantine protocols that emerged from these desperate negotiations represented a new form of siege warfare that neither side had anticipated. Entire sectors of Terra were sealed off when outbreaks occurred, their populations abandoned to fate while the spread of contagion was contained. The decisions were made with mathematical coldness, but each quarantine zone contained thousands of civilians whose only crime had been residence in the wrong district when Mortarian's gifts arrived. Yet the plague proved to be less discriminating than its creator had intended. The orbital fortress stations that comprised Perturabo's Iron Ring began to report outbreaks among their own crews as the diseases spread through ventilation systems that had been designed for efficiency rather than biological security. The pathogens that Mortarian had crafted to exploit the weaknesses of siege conditions proved equally effective against both loyalist and traitor installations. Brother Captain Typhon of the Death Guard stood in the medical bay of Orbital Station Quintus and watched his own men succumb to diseases that should have granted them immunity. The irony was not lost on him that the weapons they had deployed against their enemies were proving equally lethal to their own forces. The plagues had evolved beyond their creator's control, becoming entities that served no master save their own multiplication. "The gifts of Nurgle are not always what they seem," Typhon observed to his lieutenant, watching as another Death Guard Marine was taken by convulsions that spoke of systemic organ failure. "We thought ourselves immune because we serve the Lord of Decay. Yet immunity and service are not the same thing. The plague serves Grandfather's will, but his will may not align with our immediate tactical objectives." The medical innovations that emerged from the crisis pushed the boundaries of Imperial science into realms that would have been considered heretical in peacetime. Apothecaries worked alongside gang chemists and rogue tech adepts to develop treatments that combined traditional medicine with techniques that bordered on the forbidden. The pressure of imminent extinction forced compromises that peacetime ethics would never have permitted. Chief Medica Joanna Kreutz had spent 40 years in service to the Imperium's medical establishment, but the siege's biological crisis demanded innovations that challenged every principle she had been taught. Working in laboratories, that had been hastily established in the deepest parts of the imperial palace, she found herself pioneering techniques that used controlled exposure to the plagues themselves as a form of inoculation. "We are walking a path between damnation and salvation," she confided to her assistants as they prepared another batch of experimental treatments. These diseases were crafted by servants of chaos, yet we must understand them intimately if we hope to defeat them. We risk corruption with every sample we study, yet ignorance guarantees extinction. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The siege-born generation that had grown to maturity within Terra's walls possessed immune systems that had adapted to conditions that would have killed their parents. Their bodies had learned to process toxins and resist diseases as a natural consequence of growing up in an environment where such abilities were essential for survival. Cadet Medicae Elena Vasquez, now in her 20s and serving as a field medic in the worst affected sectors, discovered that her blood contained antibodies that could neutralize some of Mortarian's more virulent creations. The discovery led to research programs that treated the siege-born as a unique subspecies of humanity, one that had evolved specific adaptations to survive in conditions of permanent warfare. "We are no longer entirely human," Elena reported to the medical council, her voice carrying the matter-of-fact tone that marked her generation's approach to extraordinary circumstances. "The siege has changed us at a genetic level. Our children will be different from us, as we are different from those who lived before the walls went up. Evolution does not wait for permission." The establishment of joint medical protocols between loyalist and traitor forces represented one of the siege's most significant developments. Both sides recognized that the plague threatened their survival more than each other's military actions, and pragmatic cooperation became essential for containing outbreaks that recognized no factional boundaries. The medical exchanges took place in neutral zones that had been hastily established in the ruins between the major siege lines. These areas became islands of truce, where Death Guard apothecaries worked alongside Blood Angels medics to develop treatments for diseases that threatened them all equally. The cooperation was limited and fragile, but it demonstrated that even the bitterest enemies could find common ground when faced with extinction. Apothecary Grulgor of the Death Guard met with his loyalist counterparts in circumstances that would have been impossible to imagine when the siege began. The meeting took place in a medical station that had been constructed in the ruins of a civilian district, its walls bearing the insignia of both factions as a symbol of their temporary cooperation. The plagues serve Nurgle's will, but Nurgle's will is not always aligned with tactical necessity, Grulgor admitted to his former brothers, his words carrying the weight of reluctant honesty. These diseases were meant to break your resistance, not to consume everything equally. Their evolution beyond our control represents a failure of planning that we must address collectively. The joint research that emerged from these desperate alliances produced innovations that revolutionized battlefield medicine throughout the galaxy. Techniques for rapid disease identification, protocols for containing biological outbreaks in enclosed environments, and treatments that could function in the absence of traditional medical infrastructure became standard practice for military forces across the Imperium. Yet the cost of these advances was measured in millions of lives lost during the initial outbreaks. Entire districts of Terra were depopulated by diseases that killed faster than treatments could be developed. The quarantine zones became monuments to the speed with which biological warfare could transform a strategic situation into an existential crisis. Sanguinius walked through one such zone wearing atmospheric protection that made him appear more like a walking monument than a living being. The angel's usual grace was constrained by the bulky equipment required to survive in environments where the very air had become toxic. Around him, stretched the remnants of what had once been a thriving civilian district, now reduced to empty buildings that served as tombs for those who had been too slow to evacuate. "This is what victory looks like when achieved through plague," the angel said to his companions, his voice filtered through mechanical systems that stripped away all emotional nuance. Empty streets and silent buildings. Not conquest, but extinction. Mortarion has shown us what lies beyond the boundaries of honorable warfare, and the lesson is one that none of us will forget. The plague crisis established new parameters for the siege that would persist for the remainder of the conflict. Both sides had learned that biological warfare could threaten their survival more effectively than conventional military action, but they had also developed countermeasures that made such weapons less decisive than their creators had hoped. The siege had adapted once again, incorporating new forms of horror into its already complex ecosystem of violence. By the crisis's end, Terra's population had been reduced by perhaps a third, but those who remained had developed immunities and technologies that made them more resistant to biological attack than any human population in history. The siege-born generation had proven their worth as adapters and innovators, establishing themselves as the inheritors of a conflict that had shaped them into something beyond what their ancestors had imagined possible. Mortarion observed the results of his biological campaign from the bridge of the Endurance, his ancient features marked by something approaching disappointment. The plagues had killed millions, but they had not broken the siege. Terra still stood defiant. Its defenders still resisted, and the war continued with its fundamental character unchanged. "Grandfather Nurgle teaches patience above all virtues," the Pale King murmured to himself, his words carrying the weight of reluctant acceptance. Perhaps the siege itself is his greatest gift. Not a war to be won, but a crucible to transform all who enter it into something more honest than what they were before. The lesson was clear to all who survived the plague years. The siege had become something beyond conventional warfare, a force of transformation that touched everything within its sphere, and changed it according to laws that transcended human understanding. Victory and defeat had become meaningless concepts compared to the simple necessity of continued existence in the face of challenges that pushed the boundaries of what life could endure. 50 years into the siege, the war had outlived the memory of peace. An entire generation of warriors had been born, trained, and aged within the shadow of Terra's orbital cage, knowing conflict not as an interruption of normal life, but as the fundamental condition of existence. The anniversary passed without ceremony, marked only by the routine exchange of artillery fire that had become as regular as the turning of seasons. Yet beneath the mechanical rhythm of daily warfare, something profound was stirring. Questions that had been unthinkable in the siege's desperate early years were beginning to find voice among those who had inherited a conflict they had played no part in starting. The formal diplomatic exchanges had begun almost by accident, emerging from the practical necessities of managing a siege that had grown beyond any individual's ability to comprehend. Supply officers who needed to coordinate prisoner exchanges found themselves discussing broader issues of mutual survival. Medical personnel who collaborated on plague containment began to share observations about the siege's psychological effects on both sides. These conversations, initially focused on immediate tactical concerns, gradually evolved into something approaching genuine diplomacy. Ambassador Helena Corvanis had been appointed by the Terran Senate to formalize what had previously been handled through unofficial channels. Her title was entirely unprecedented in Imperial history, as the Imperium had never before needed to conduct diplomatic relations with enemies who were simultaneously brothers. She met her counterpart from the traitor forces in a prefabricated structure erected in the neutral zone between the siege lines, a building that served no purpose other than to provide a space where sworn enemies could speak without killing each other. "We have been fighting for 50 years, Corvinus observed to Lord Commander Eidolon of the Emperor's Children, her words carrying the weight of exhaustion that marked all who had lived through the siege's entire duration. "Our children have grown to adulthood, knowing nothing but war. Our grandchildren learn to walk in tunnels that echo with gunfire. At what point does continuing the fight become less about victory than about avoiding the admission that victory may be impossible?" Eidolon's response reflected the same weariness that had begun to afflict warriors on both sides of the conflict. "The war has become our identity, Ambassador. We are no longer the legions that landed on Terra 50 years ago. We are something new, shaped by decades of siege warfare into creatures that exist only within the context of this conflict. To end the war would be to destroy ourselves as surely as defeat would." The conversations that took place in those diplomatic sessions were recorded by scribes from both factions, creating an archive of negotiations that would have been unthinkable when the siege began. The documents revealed the extent to which the conflict had transformed from ideological struggle into something approaching mutual dependence. Both sides had invested so much in the siege's continuation that its conclusion threatened their fundamental identity. Yet even as formal diplomacy emerged, the siege spawned new forms of religious devotion that elevated the conflict itself to the status of divine purpose. The cult of eternal war emerged among the siege-born generation, preaching that the siege was not a temporary crisis, but a permanent revelation of humanity's true nature. Their doctrine held that peace was an artificial construct, while war represented the honest expression of human character. Brother Chaplain Matthias Kane of the Imperial Fists found himself confronting a form of heresy that traditional theology had never anticipated. The siege cults did not worship chaos gods or reject the emperor's authority, but they elevated warfare itself to the status of sacred mystery. Their adherents were exemplary soldiers who fought with dedication that surpassed even veteran space marines. Yet their motivation came from sources that troubled those who remembered the Imperium before the siege began. "They pray to the war itself," Caney reported to his superiors in communications that were heavily encrypted to prevent interception by cult sympathizers. "They see the siege not as a trial to be endured, but as a spiritual discipline that purifies the soul through constant struggle. They fight more effectively than any troops we have fielded, yet their devotion is to conflict rather than to the imperial truth." The cult's influence spread beyond Terra's defenders to affect the traitor legions as well. Warriors who had originally turned against the emperor found themselves worshipping the siege as a manifestation of deeper truths about the nature of existence. The conflict had become larger than its original participants, developing its own momentum and its own theology that transcended the factional loyalties that had initiated it. Among the Space Marines, creatures engineered to fight without rest or doubt, the first instances of genuine war weariness began to manifest. These were not cowards or weaklings, but veterans whose superhuman physiology was finally succumbing to stresses that had never been anticipated by their creators. 50 years of constant warfare had pushed even their enhanced bodies and minds beyond sustainable limits. Captain Uriel Korath of the White Scars submitted the first formal request for leave that had been filed by a Space Marine officer in the siege's history. His request was unprecedented, not because Space Marines were forbidden to rest, but because none had ever felt the need to ask. The psychological pressures of endless warfare had finally overcome conditioning that had been designed to prevent such feelings from ever arising. I have fought, without question, for 50 years, Korath's petition stated, its formal language barely concealing the desperation beneath. I have killed enemies whose names I never learned, in battles whose objectives I no longer remember, for reasons that were clear 50 years ago, but have become obscured by the passage of time. I request permission to remember why we fight, because I fear that I have forgotten. Perturabo observed these developments from his command center aboard the Iron Blood, with the detached interest of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had undergone his own transformation during the siege's long course, becoming increasingly machine-like in his thinking and behavior. He analyzed the siege's evolution with the same dispassionate precision he applied to artillery calculations, viewing the psychological breakdowns and cult formations as data points in a larger equation. The siege has achieved perfect efficiency, Perturabo observed to his lieutenant, Foryx, as they reviewed reports of mounting war weariness among both loyalist and traitor forces. It sustains itself through the energy generated by its own continuation. Every attempt to end it creates new reasons for its perpetuation. We have created something beyond warfare, beyond strategy, beyond purpose. We have created a perfect machine for the consumption of human will. Yet even Perturabo's machine-like composure was beginning to show signs of strain. His subordinates reported that the Primarch spent increasing amounts of time alone in his private chambers, working on calculations that bore no apparent relationship to tactical necessity. He had begun to speak of the siege in terms that suggested he viewed it as an end in itself, rather than a means to achieve victory. The secret meetings between Rogel Dawn and Perturabo represented the siege's most significant development since its establishment. The two Primarchs, bitter rivals whose tactical genius had shaped the conflict from its beginning, found themselves drawn together by the recognition that they had created something beyond either of their abilities to control. The meetings took place in abandoned sectors of the siege zone, areas that had been fought over so extensively that both sides had eventually abandoned them as untenable. Dawn and Perturabo met without escorts or witnesses, their conversations protected by the mutual understanding that some topics could not be discussed through formal diplomatic channels. We have become prisoners of our own success, Dawn admitted during one such meeting, his words carrying the weight of a man who had dedicated his life to defensive warfare only to discover that perfect defense could become its own form of defeat. Your siege works are so effective that they have trapped us all. My fortifications are so complete that they cannot be abandoned without admitting that 50 years of sacrifice have been meaningless. Perturabo's response revealed depths of philosophical consideration that his role as siege engineer had never required him to explore. The siege was meant to be a tool, brother, a means to achieve strategic objectives that were defined before its beginning. Yet tools sometimes reshape those who wield them. We are no longer the same beings who initiated this conflict. The question is whether the creatures we have become are capable of ending what our former selves began. The conversations between the two Primarchs ranged across topics that had never been addressed in formal military doctrine. They discussed the psychological effects of generational warfare on populations that had never known peace. They analyzed the sociological implications of societies organized entirely around the requirements of siege defense. They explored the philosophical question of whether conflicts could achieve sufficient complexity to become independent entities that served their own continuation rather than their creators' objectives. Among the younger generation of Imperial Army officers, those who had been born after the siege's establishment, a different form of questioning was emerging, These were not war-weary veterans seeking rest, but young leaders who had never experienced the peace their elders claimed to be fighting to preserve. For them, the siege was not an aberration to be ended, but the natural state of affairs that peace would disrupt. Colonel Marcus Vane had been born in the siege's 7th year, and had risen through the ranks based on his understanding of warfare as it actually existed, rather than how it had been conducted before Terra's encirclement. His tactical innovations were based on assumptions about permanent conflict that would have been heretical to previous generations of military theorists. "We fight to preserve something that none of us have ever experienced," Vane explained to his staff during a strategic planning session that had become as much philosophical discussion as military briefing. "We speak of peace as a goal, yet our entire society is organized around the principles of war. Our children are educated for conflict. Our economics are based on military production. Our culture celebrates martial virtues above all others. What exactly would we become if peace were achieved?" The question was spreading through the younger ranks of both loyalist and traitor forces. Those who had grown to maturity within the siege found themselves questioning objectives that their parents had accepted without doubt. They had been raised to be perfect soldiers for a conflict that seemed to have transcended the purposes for which it was initiated. The siege cults provided answers to these questions by elevating the conflict itself to the status of ultimate meaning. According to their doctrine, the siege was not a means to achieve peace, but the revelation that peace had always been an illusion. War was humanity's natural state, and the siege represented the perfection of human society, organized around honest acknowledgement of that truth. High cultist Sarah Mendoza preached to congregations that included both loyalist defenders and traitor besiegers, her sermons broadcast through communication channels that had been established for coordination between forces that had learned to cooperate despite their ideological differences. Her message resonated with those who had been born into the siege and shaped by its requirements. "The siege teaches us that struggle is the fundamental condition of existence," Mendoza declared to audiences that numbered in the hundreds of thousands across both sides of the conflict. Those who came before us lived in denial of this truth, creating artificial structures of peace that could not survive contact with reality. We are blessed to live in honest acknowledgement of what we are, creatures of war who find meaning through conflict. The psychological impact of these developments reached even the highest levels of command. Horus himself began to show signs of uncertainty about objectives that had seemed clear when the siege began. The War Master's speeches to his followers took on increasingly abstract qualities, focusing on the spiritual significance of struggle rather than concrete goals of conquest. Sanguinius experienced similar uncertainty, but his doubts took the form of increasing isolation rather than philosophical speculation. The angel spent more time alone in his private chambers, contemplating the transformation of his own nature during 50 years of constant warfare. The noble being who had arrived at Terra's defense was barely recognizable in the hardened warrior he had become. By the siege's 50th anniversary, both sides had achieved a form of stability that might theoretically continue indefinitely. The conflict had evolved beyond victory or defeat into something approaching stalemate as a permanent condition. Yet that stability came at the cost of transforming everyone involved into something they had never intended to become. The war had become self-sustaining, feeding on its own continuation rather than serving external objectives. Those who fought it were no longer the same beings who had begun it, and the society that had emerged from 50 years of siege bore little resemblance to anything that had existed before Terra's encirclement. The question that haunted the secret meetings between Dawn and Perturabo was whether the siege had become too perfect to end, too integrated into the identity of its participants to be abandoned without destroying everything they had become in its service. The iron cage was no longer just a military fortification, but a way of life that had shaped an entire civilization around the requirements of permanent warfare. 60 years into the siege, the Emperor rose from the Golden Throne for the first time in 2 decades. His emergence sent ripples through the warp that were felt across the galaxy, as if reality itself was adjusting to accommodate the return of a being who had transcended ordinary existence. The Master of Mankind had spent 60 years focused on psychic battles that dwarfed the physical conflict raging on Terra's surface. But the siege had reached a point where even his vast consciousness could no longer ignore the material realm's requirements. The Emperor's physical form had changed during his long vigil on the throne. Where once he had appeared as a golden giant of perfect human proportion, now he blazed with energies that made direct observation impossible for mortal eyes. His presence warped the very air around him, causing gravity to fluctuate and time to flow at inconsistent rates. He was no longer entirely human, if he had ever been such a thing, but something that existed simultaneously in material reality and the immaterium beyond. Captain General Constantin Valdor felt his master's awakening before seeing it, as psychic pressure that had been building for decades suddenly found release. The custodian had maintained his vigil outside the throne room for 60 years, watching for any sign that the Emperor might emerge to provide guidance to his beleaguered defenders. Now that emergence had come, but it brought with it implications that no tactical doctrine had ever anticipated. My lord, the Emperor's consciousness expanded beyond his physical form, reaching through the warp to strike directly at the traitor fleet positions that comprised Perturabo's iron ring. This was not warfare, as it had been conducted for 60 years, but the application of power on a scale that transcended conventional military action. The first orbital fortress station to feel the Emperor's attention simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Its physical structure remained intact, but everything within it was transformed into crystalline formations that pulsed with energies borrowed from dimensions beyond normal space. The crew members, both living and mechanical, were preserved in their final moments, but changed into something that was no longer entirely material. Perturabo felt the assault as a physical blow that sent him staggering across the bridge of the Iron Blood. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had engineered his siege works to withstand any conventional attack, but the Emperor's psychic offensive operated according to principles that his mathematical genius had never been forced to consider. His perfect siege machine was being dismantled not through superior strategy, but through the application of power that existed outside the realm of tactical calculation. Impossible, Perturabo breathed, his augmented senses struggling to process data that defied every principle of physics he understood. The Emperor attacks not through space, but through the warp itself. He strikes at the conceptual foundation of our positions, rather than their physical structure. The iron ring began to collapse as fortress after fortress fell to the Emperor's assault. Yet this was not the swift victory that Terra's defenders might have hoped for, because the Emperor's use of such vast psychic power created opportunities that the forces of chaos were swift to exploit. The barrier between reality and the immaterium, already weakened by 60 years of concentrated violence, began to tear under the pressure of divine intervention. Horus felt the Emperor's awakening as both threat and opportunity. The War Master had grown in power during the siege's long course, fed by the worship of those who served him and the offerings of slaughter that 60 years of warfare had provided. Yet he remained fundamentally material in nature, while his father had transcended such limitations. The contest that was about to begin would be fought on multiple levels of reality simultaneously. The counterattack came not through conventional weapons, but through the summoning of demonic entities on a scale that had never before been attempted. Horus opened portals to the deepest reaches of the warp, calling forth legions of beings that existed purely as expressions of malevolent will. These were not the lesser demons that had occasionally manifested during the siege's earlier phases, but princes and lords of chaos, whose presence in reality required massive expenditures of psychic energy to sustain. Magnus the Red participated in the summoning with enthusiasm that bordered on madness. The Crimson King's sanity had been steadily eroded by 60 years of exposure to the siege's psychic emanations, and the opportunity to wield power on such a vast scale appealed to the part of him that had always been fascinated by forbidden knowledge. His consciousness reached into realms where mortal minds were never meant to venture, bargaining with entities that promised power in exchange for prices that he no longer possessed the clarity to calculate. "Let the veils be torn," Magnus cried, as he channeled energies that transformed the space around him into something that resembled the inside of a living flame. "Let reality learn to bow before will. The siege has prepared us for this moment when the false divisions between material and immaterial are finally abolished." The result was the first warp storm to manifest within Terra's atmosphere since the planet's initial colonization. Reality became fluid in ways that challenged the sanity of all who witnessed it. Physical laws operated according to the emotional states of nearby observers. Gravity flowed like liquid, sometimes pulling sideways or upward, rather than toward planetary center. Time moved at different rates in different locations, creating zones where minutes stretched into hours, while seconds elsewhere compressed into temporal singularities. The defenders of Terra found themselves fighting enemies that should not have been able to exist in material space. Demons of pure malice stalked through corridors where physics operated according to the principles of nightmare rather than natural law. Imperial fists fired bolter rounds that transformed into flowering vines or crystalline sculptures, depending on the emotional resonance of their targets. Brother Captain Lysander led his company through a section of the Imperial Palace where the walls bled colors that had no names, and doors opened onto vistas of alien worlds that existed in distant galaxies. His warriors adapted to battlefield conditions that would have been impossible to imagine when the siege began, using training that had been modified by 60 years of increasingly supernatural warfare. "We fight not just enemies, but reality itself," Lysander reported through communication channels that sometimes carried his words backward through time or translated them into musical harmonies that conveyed emotion rather than information. "The siege has become something beyond warfare. We battle for the right to determine what existence means." Sanguinius found himself uniquely suited to this new form of combat. The angel's psychic sensitivity, which had been a source of torment during the siege's conventional phases, became an asset when dealing with enemies that existed primarily as expressions of will and emotion. He moved through the transformed battlefield with grace that transcended physical limitation, his every action harmonized with the fluid nature of reality that surrounded him. Yet even Sanguinius was not immune to the transformative effects of warfare that operated on metaphysical principles. His noble features began to show signs of change as he was exposed to energies that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space. His wings developed patterns of coloration that shifted according to his emotional state. His eyes began to reflect depths that seemed to contain entire universes of possibility. The Emperor's gambit had succeeded in breaking the Iron Ring, but at costs that no tactical analysis had anticipated. Terra itself began to exist partially within the warp, its physical structure interpenetrated by dimensions where thought became substance and will determined natural law. The planet that had been humanity's birth world was becoming something entirely new, a hybrid of material and immaterial existence. The siege continued, but it was no longer recognizable as the conflict that had begun 60 years earlier. Warriors fought battles that were simultaneously physical engagements and philosophical debates about the nature of existence. Weapons functioned according to the beliefs of those who wielded them, rather than their designed specifications. Victory and defeat became fluid concepts that could change meaning, depending on the perspective from which they were observed. Perturabo struggled to adapt his tactical genius to conditions where mathematics itself was subject to revision by nearby consciousnesses. His siege works, once models of geometric perfection, became organic structures that grew and evolved according to principles he could not calculate. The Iron Warrior's Primarch found himself forced to develop new forms of strategic thinking that incorporated variables he had never been trained to consider. "The siege has transcended strategy," Perturabo reported to his subordinates through communication systems that sometimes transmitted pure emotion rather than words. "We must adapt to conditions where the battlefield itself is a combatant. Our enemy is not just the defenders of Terra, but the nature of reality in the space around Terra." The Emperor's return to the Golden Throne came not as a choice, but as a necessity. The psychic energies required to maintain his direct intervention in the material realm were draining reserves that he needed for battles being fought on levels of existence that mortal minds could not perceive. Yet his withdrawal came too late to prevent fundamental changes to the siege's nature. Terror existed simultaneously in multiple dimensions of reality, its surface overlaid with reflections of warp space that responded to the emotional states of its inhabitants. The siege had become a crucible not just for military innovation, but for the evolution of human consciousness itself. Those who fought in its transformed battlefields were being changed at levels more fundamental than the merely physical. Malcador the Sigillite found himself serving as regent for a world that no longer entirely existed in normal space-time. The challenges of governance had expanded beyond administrative complexity to include managing populations that sometimes experienced past and future simultaneously, or found themselves temporarily translated into dimensions where communication occurred through color and musical harmony rather than speech. "We have achieved something unprecedented," Malcador observed to his staff during a council meeting, where some participants appeared as geometric patterns that conveyed meaning through their mathematical relationships. "The siege has become a laboratory for the transformation of human nature itself. We are no longer the species that our ancestors would recognize." The transformation was irreversible. Even if the siege were to end, Terra and all who had lived through its metaphysical phase would remain forever changed. They had become something new, adapted to existence in a reality where the boundaries between material and immaterial were fluid rather than absolute. The Emperor's gambit had broken Perturabo's iron ring, but it had also broken the certainties upon which human civilization had been built. The siege continued, but as a contest between forms of consciousness that were evolving beyond anything that had previously existed in the galaxy. Victory, when it came, would not restore what had been lost, but create something entirely unprecedented in human experience. The war had become a force of transformation that affected not just its participants, but the fundamental nature of the reality in which they existed. Those who survived it would emerge as something beyond human, adapted to a universe where will and belief held equal weight with physical law in determining what was possible. In the aftermath of the Emperor's gambit, Terra existed in a state that defied every principle of physics that humanity had ever discovered. Time flowed like liquid through the siege zone, pooling in some areas where minutes stretched into hours, while rushing through others in torrents that compressed years into heartbeats. The planet that had once been humanity's birthworld had become a testing ground for forms of existence that transcended the boundaries between material reality and the immaterium beyond. The Imperial fists manning the Eternity Gate found themselves defending positions that existed simultaneously in multiple temporal states. Brother Sergeant Kroger fired his bolter at enemies who had not yet arrived, while dodging attacks that had been launched days in the past, but were only now reaching their intended targets. His battle brothers fought alongside the spirits of Imperial fists who had died decades earlier, but whose essence had become fused with the fortress walls they had died defending. "Time is broken here," Kroger reported through communication channels that sometimes carried his words to recipients who had been dead for years, or to versions of his commanders that would not exist for decades to come. "We fight not just in the present, but in all possible presents, simultaneously. The siege has become unstuck from linear causation." The phenomenon was not limited to the Loyalist forces. Across the siege lines, traitor legionaries found themselves aided by demonic entities that were no longer separate beings, but had become fused with the warriors they served. These hybrid creatures retained the tactical knowledge of their mortal components, while wielding power that operated according to the fluid logic of the warp, rather than the constraints of physical law. Brother Vorthak of the Iron Warriors discovered that his body had begun to incorporate elements of the siege works he had spent decades constructing. His flesh took on the properties of reinforced ceramite, while his bones developed the geometric patterns that marked the most efficient load-bearing structures. He was becoming architecture as much as warrior, a living embodiment of the fortifications that had defined his existence for 70 years. His legion bond with the 1,000 Suns had evolved into something approaching hive mind consciousness, their individual identities subsumed into a collective entity that existed primarily within the warp. Truth and falsehood danced together in patterns too complex for linear minds to follow. Magnus declared to followers who heard his words through channels that bypassed physical sound entirely. "I serve the Emperor by opposing him. I honor my father by seeking his destruction. The siege has taught us that contradiction is simply another form of harmony." The geography of Terra itself had become subject to the emotional states of its defenders. Sectors where hope flourished developed architectural features that resembled flowering gardens built from living metal. Areas dominated by despair transformed into labyrinthine mazes, where corridors led back upon themselves in patterns that trapped the unwary in cycles of endless repetition. Veterans who had been killed in earlier battles occasionally manifested as temporal echoes, their knowledge and experience available to commanders who could establish communication across chronological boundaries. Sergeant Vex Korath, the same gang lord who had negotiated survival pacts during the plague years, found himself aging backward through exposure to chronological anomalies that reversed the flow of causation in localized areas. His body grew younger, while his mind retained decades of accumulated experience, creating a warrior whose physical capabilities far exceeded what his tactical knowledge should have been able to achieve. "I remember being older," Korath said, as he led raids through zones where cause preceded effect and victory could be achieved by understanding battles that had not yet been fought. "I remember dying in fights that haven't happened yet. The siege has made prophets of us all, whether we wanted such gifts or not. The daemon engines that both sides deployed had evolved beyond their original mechanical nature into entities that existed as pure expressions of will given form. They no longer required fuel or ammunition, drawing power directly from the emotional resonance of nearby combatants. The more intense the fighting, the stronger they became, creating feedback loops that amplified violence through supernatural means. Forgemaster Carax of the Dark Mechanicum observed these developments with fascination that transcended his original programming. His own body had undergone modifications that incorporated elements of pure thought made manifest, allowing him to interface directly with demon engines through mental processes that bypassed physical control systems entirely. The siege has become self-aware. Carax transmitted through communication protocols that existed as mathematical equations rather than conventional data streams. It is developing its own consciousness through the accumulated experience of all who have participated in its continuation. We are not fighting a war, but serving as neurons in a vast mind that is learning to think. Sanguinius found that his psychic sensitivity, already heightened by decades of siege warfare, had expanded to encompass awareness of multiple probability streams simultaneously. The angel could perceive not just what was happening, but what might happen and what should have happened if different choices had been made throughout the siege's long history. His wings had grown additional sets of feathers that existed primarily in the warp, allowing him to fly through dimensions that intersected with physical reality at oblique angles. His presence on the battlefield created zones of stability, where time flowed in recognizable patterns, making him a rallying point for warriors whose sanity was threatened by constant exposure to temporal anomalies. I see all possible versions of this siege playing out simultaneously, Sanguinius confided to his most trusted lieutenants during strategy sessions that took place across multiple time streams concurrently. In some, we achieve victory through conventional means. In others, defeat comes through familiar failures. But in most, the siege simply continues forever, becoming a permanent feature of reality that outlasts all of us. The transformation was not limited to combatants. Civilians who had survived 70 years within the siege zone developed abilities that would have been considered psychic mutations in normal circumstances, but were simply adaptive responses to an environment where consciousness and reality interacted in unprecedented ways. Elena Vasquez, now serving as a colonel in the siege-born generation's command structure, discovered that she could communicate with the spirits of ancient Terrans whose essence had been absorbed into the planet's substrate during the reality storms. These ghostly advisors provided tactical intelligence about Terra's hidden infrastructure that no living person possessed. "The dead remain with us," Elena reported, during briefings that included participants who existed primarily as disembodied consciousness. They have become part of Terra's defensive network, their knowledge and experience integrated into the planet's systems at levels deeper than any technology could achieve. The iron ring that had once encircled Terra in orbital space had been transformed into something approaching a living organism. Perturabo's original fortress stations had grown together through connections that existed partially in the warp, creating a siege engine that operated according to principles of biological development rather than mechanical engineering. Perturabo himself struggled to maintain his identity as the master of this evolved siege mechanism. The Iron Warrior's Primarch found his consciousness expanding to encompass the entire orbital network, his individual thoughts becoming distributed across thousands of gun emplacements and fortress systems. He was becoming the siege in the most literal sense possible. "I am no longer Perturabo," he transmitted, through channels that carried meaning through structural harmonics rather than words. I am the architectural expression of siege warfare made manifest. Every gun is my finger. Every wall is my bone. Every calculation is my thought. The iron ring lives through me, and I exist through it. The imperial palace itself had begun to exhibit properties that suggested consciousness on a scale that dwarfed individual human awareness. Corridors rearranged themselves to optimize defensive efficiency. Walls developed firing positions that appeared exactly where they were needed most. The entire structure was becoming a single massive organism dedicated to the preservation of the Emperor's presence at its heart. Malcador the Sigillite found himself serving as an interpreter between this emergent consciousness and the human defenders who still thought in terms of conventional military strategy. Yet even they were being transformed by exposure to conditions that pushed the boundaries of what consciousness could become while retaining any recognizable human characteristics. Some developed the ability to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. Others began to age according to emotional intensity rather than chronological progression. A few discovered that they could survive physical death by transferring their awareness into the siege infrastructure itself. The war that had begun as a conflict between brothers had evolved into something that transcended individual identity entirely. Combatants on both sides found their consciousness merging with larger patterns of meaning that operated according to principles beyond conventional understanding. Victory and defeat became irrelevant concepts compared to the simple continuation of existence in forms that were no longer entirely mortal. Horus observed these developments from the bridge of the vengeful spirit, his own form undergoing transformations that reflected his growing distance from humanity. The War Master had become something approaching a force of nature, his presence capable of altering local reality through the application of will alone. Yet even his expanded consciousness struggled to comprehend what the siege had become. We sought to conquer Terra, Horus mused, as he watched battles being fought by entities that had once been his sons, but were now something far more complex. Instead, Terra has conquered us all. We have become part of its story rather than the authors of our own destinies. The siege writes itself now, using our transformed nature as its vocabulary. The recognition that they were no longer in control of their own creation was perhaps the most profound transformation of all. The siege had achieved a form of independence that made its original participants into servants of purposes they had never intended to create. They fought not for victory, but for the continuation of something that had become larger than any individual will or faction loyalty. In the depths of the imperial palace, the emperor remained seated upon the golden throne, his consciousness engaged in battles that made the siege's physical manifestation seem like a minor skirmish by comparison. Yet even his vast awareness was being affected by the transformation of reality around Terra, his divine nature evolving in response to challenges that pushed the boundaries of what even a god could become. The siege had transcended warfare to become a form of existence that redefined what it meant to be human, to be alive, or to be real. Those who participated in it were no longer the same species that had originally come to Terra's defense or had sought its conquest. They had become something new, adapted to reality that operated according to principles that their ancestors could never have imagined. 80 years into the siege, command had passed to those who had been born within its embrace and shaped by its requirements rather than the ideals that had initiated the conflict. The third generation of siege-born leaders understood the war not as an aberration to be ended, but as a complex ecosystem that required careful management to maintain its delicate balance. They spoke with authority that came from intimate knowledge of every tunnel, every firing position, every supply route that kept their civilization functioning in conditions that would have destroyed their ancestors. Colonel General Marcus Thorne had been born in the siege's 15th year to parents who served in the munitions corps, growing to maturity in the deep tunnels where recycled air carried the scent of promethium and cordite as naturally as flowers might have perfumed gardens in the world that existed before the Iron Ring. At 55, he commanded defensive sectors that encompassed territories larger than some pre-siege nations. Yet he had never seen unfiltered sunlight or breathed air that had not been processed through atmospheric scrubbers. His counterpart among the traitor forces was Legion Marshal Vex Corvallis, daughter of a Death Guard apothecary and a remembrancer who had documented the siege's early phases before taking up arms herself. Corvallis understood the siege's rhythms with instinctive precision that her genetic father's enhanced senses couldn't match. She had learned warfare not from tactical manuals, but from practical experience managing resources that were always insufficient and coordinating forces that operated according to principles her elders had never anticipated. The first formal negotiations between siege-born leaders from opposing sides took place in a neutral zone that had been established in the ruins of the former administratum complex. The building itself had been fought over so many times that both sides had eventually declared it holy ground, too saturated with the blood of martyrs to serve any purpose except as a meeting place for discussions that transcended factional loyalty. "We understand each other in ways our fathers never could," Thorne observed, as he sat across a table made from fused ceramite and plasteel, materials that had been shaped by artillery fire into something approaching furniture. "You know the sound of shells falling in Sector Gamma as well as I do. You've calculated supply requirements for forces that live on recycled protein and filtered water. We speak the same language." Corvallis nodded, her scarred features reflecting years of exposure to toxins that had been part of her environment since birth. "The old reasons for fighting have become mythology to us. We fight because fighting is what our civilization does, not because we remember why the fight began. The question is whether we can manage this conflict more efficiently than those who came before us." The negotiations that emerged from such meetings represented a fundamental shift in how the siege was conducted. The third generation had learned to think in terms of sustainable warfare rather than decisive victory. They established protocols for managing resources that might need to last for centuries, created systems for training recruits who would never know any life except siege warfare, and developed technologies that could function indefinitely in conditions that pushed the boundaries of what human engineering could achieve. Yet the most significant change was their relationship with the original Primarchs, who had undergone transformations that placed them beyond conventional military command structures. Rogel Dawn had become so integrated with Terra's defensive systems that he existed more as a distributed consciousness throughout the fortification network than as an individual leader. His physical form appeared only occasionally, and when it did, it seemed more like a manifestation of the siege's defensive will than a recognizable being. Brother Captain Lysander, now one of the few remaining links between the siege-born generation and the original Imperial Fists, struggled to maintain communication with his Primarch through channels that bypassed conventional speech. "Lord Dawn no longer speaks in words that normal minds can process," he reported to the new generation of commanders who had assumed practical authority over day-to-day operations. "His consciousness has expanded to encompass every defensive position on Terra. He experiences attack and defense as personal sensations rather than abstract tactical concepts." The transformation was even more pronounced among the traitor Primarchs. Perturabo had become virtually indistinguishable from the Iron Ring itself, his awareness distributed across thousands of fortress stations that operated according to his thoughts rather than transmitted orders. His original body remained aboard the Iron Blood, but it functioned more as a focal point for a vast mechanical consciousness than as the seat of individual identity. Magnus the Red had transcended physical existence almost entirely, manifesting primarily as patterns of psychic energy that influenced events through manipulation of probability and causation rather than direct intervention. His 1,000 sons reported receiving orders through dreams, visions, and mathematical equations that appeared in their minds without apparent source. The siege-born generation adapted to these developments with pragmatic flexibility that would have been impossible for their predecessors. They created new command structures that could function with leaders who might exist primarily as distributed consciousness, environmental factors, or abstract mathematical principles. They learned to interpret orders that came as intuitive understanding rather than spoken commands. Elena Vasquez, now serving as Marshal General of the siege-born auxiliary forces, had developed abilities that allowed her to communicate directly with the transformed consciousness of Terra itself. She could sense the planet's needs and desires as clearly as she could read conventional intelligence reports, making her invaluable as an intermediary between human commanders and the increasingly non-human forces that defended their world. Terra dreams of perfect protection, Eleanor explained to her staff during briefings that took place as much through shared psychic experience as conventional discussion. The planet has developed its own will to survive, and that will expresses itself through us. We are no longer defending Terra so much as serving as the instruments through which Terra defends itself. This understanding led to successful small-scale evacuations of non-combatants, operations that would have been impossible under the rigid ideological framework that had governed the siege's early phases. The third generation recognized that some civilians served no military purpose and represented unnecessary drain on resources that could be better used to maintain the siege's long-term stability. The evacuations were conducted through temporary ceasefires negotiated between siege-born leaders who understood each other's constraints better than they understood the motivations of their own genetic or ideological ancestors. These operations represented the first successful humanitarian efforts in the siege's 8-decade history, made possible by commanders who prioritized practical results over symbolic victories. Commander Sarah Kane led one such evacuation, coordinating with her traitor counterpart to establish safe corridors through contested zones that had been battlefields for longer than either of them had been alive. The operation required trust between enemies who had more in common with each other than with their own factional leadership, a development that would have been unthinkable when the siege began. "We saved 3,000 civilians today," Kaney reported to superiors who existed primarily as voices in her head rather than physical beings she could address directly. "Children who will grow up knowing that peace is possible, even if we ourselves will never experience it. Perhaps that is victory enough." The recognition that the siege had become a civilization unto itself was perhaps the most profound development of this period. The third generation understood that they were not temporary residents of a war zone, but permanent inhabitants of a society that had evolved beyond anything that had existed before Terra's encirclement. They developed art forms that celebrated the beauty of defensive architecture, composed music that incorporated the rhythms of artillery bombardment, and created literature that treated eternal warfare as the natural condition of enlightened existence. Master chronicler David Torr documented these cultural developments with the dedication of a scholar studying an entirely new form of human society. His archives contained records of marriages conducted in ammunition depots, children's games based on tactical simulation, and religious ceremonies that incorporated the blessing of weapons as acts of worship. "We have achieved something unprecedented in human history," Tor observed in writings that would be preserved for whatever posterity might emerge from the siege's eventual conclusion. A stable society based entirely on the principles of permanent warfare. We have proven that human civilization can adapt to any conditions, even those that would have been considered impossible by previous generations. Yet the third generation's greatest achievement was their management of the original conflict's gradual transformation into something that transcended its initial causes. They understood that Horus and the Emperor were no longer individual beings whose personal conflict drove the siege, but had become archetypal forces whose opposition provided the metaphysical framework within which their civilization operated. High Administrator Joanna Corvinus, Elena's successor in managing civilian affairs, had developed protocols for conducting diplomacy with entities that existed primarily as concepts rather than physical beings. She negotiated agreements with manifestations of loyalty and rebellion as abstract principles, ensuring that the siege could continue indefinitely without requiring resolution of conflicts that had evolved beyond individual personality or ideology. We serve ideas that have outgrown their original embodiments, Corvinus explained to audiences that included both human commanders and non-human consciousnesses that had emerged from the siege's supernatural evolution. The Emperor and Horus still provide the essential tension that powers our civilization, but they no longer need to exist as recognizable individuals for that tension to remain functional. The siege-born generation's understanding of their situation was fundamentally different from anything their predecessors had experienced. They knew that pre-siege Terra had existed, but they understood it as mythology rather than history. Stories of worlds without walls, of populations that were not organized around military necessity, of times when the sky was not dominated by orbital fortress stations, seemed as fantastic to them as fairy tales. Young Captain Michael Vasquez, Elena's son, had been born 40 years into the siege and represented the pure siege-born perspective in its most refined form. He commanded forces that had never known any reality except the one they inhabited, soldiers whose understanding of tactics, strategy, and logistics had been developed specifically for conditions of permanent siege. My grandmother told stories of a time when Terra had no walls, Vasquez said, during a tactical briefing that included commanders whose experience spanned the siege's entire duration. Such stories are useful for understanding how different our civilization is from what came before, but they provide no practical guidance for the challenges we face. We must create our own precedents because we are unprecedented. This perspective allowed the third generation to make innovations that their predecessors had been unable to contemplate. They developed economic systems based on the assumption that the siege would continue indefinitely, created educational curricula designed to produce citizens who could function effectively in permanent warfare conditions, and established cultural traditions that celebrated endurance and adaptation rather than victory and conquest. The technological innovations that emerged from third-generation leadership pushed the boundaries of what human engineering could achieve under siege conditions. They created closed-loop manufacturing systems that could recycle materials with near-perfect efficiency, developed biotechnologies that could produce food in conditions where conventional agriculture was impossible, and designed communication networks that could function even when physical infrastructure was regularly destroyed and rebuilt. Chief Engineer Marcus Dawn, a descendant of the Imperial Fist's Primarch, whose genetic heritage had been preserved through artificial means after Dawn's transformation into a distributed consciousness, led research projects that would have been considered miraculous by pre-siege standards. His teams created materials that could repair themselves when damaged, weapons that drew power directly from the wielder's life force, and armor that adapted to threats by evolution rather than manual modification. We are not trying to restore what was lost, but to perfect what we have become. Marcus explained to research teams that included both human scientists and artificial intelligences that had emerged from the siege's data networks. Our civilization represents humanity's adaptation to conditions that would have destroyed our ancestors. Our technologies must reflect that evolution. By the siege's 80th anniversary, the third generation had established a form of governance that could theoretically function indefinitely without requiring resolution of the original conflict. They had created institutions that served the siege's continuation rather than its conclusion, developed social structures that could maintain stability across generations of permanent warfare, and established diplomatic protocols that could manage relationships between entities that existed as much as concepts as physical beings. Yet their greatest achievement was the recognition that they had become something genuinely new in human history. They were no longer the same species that had originally inhabited Terra or had come to besiege it. They had evolved into something adapted to conditions that their genetic ancestors could never have survived, let alone thrived within. The siege had become their natural habitat, and they had become its natural inhabitants. The question of victory or defeat had become irrelevant compared to the simple continuation of a civilization that had achieved a form of perfection within the constraints that defined its existence. In the depths of the imperial palace, what remained of the emperor observed these developments with satisfaction that transcended his original purposes. The siege had achieved something he had never intended, but had come to recognize as superior to his initial goals. Humanity had evolved beyond the limitations that had defined it since the species' emergence, becoming something capable of thriving in conditions that would have been impossible for their ancestors to survive. 90 years into the siege, both sides finally understood what they had created. The conflict that had begun as a war between brothers had evolved into something that threatened the fundamental stability of reality itself. Deep within the warp, entities that had fed on the endless violence for nearly a century were growing strong enough to challenge the established order of the immaterium. The siege was no longer just consuming the lives of its participants, but was becoming a malignant tumor in the fabric of existence that would eventually devour everything if allowed to continue. The revelation came through shared visions that manifested simultaneously among the siege-born leadership on both sides of the conflict. Master chronicler David Tor documented the phenomenon as it occurred, recording testimonies from commanders who had experienced identical prophetic dreams despite having no contact with each other for decades. The visions showed Terra not as it was, but as it would become if the siege continued, a wound in reality through which horrors beyond imagination would pour into the material universe. "We have seen the end of everything," reported Colonel General Marcus Thorne during an emergency council session that included both loyalist and traitor representatives, communicating through channels that had been established for the first time in 90 years. The siege feeds something that grows stronger with each passing year. If we do not end this conflict, it will end us all. The entity that had emerged from 9 decades of concentrated violence and suffering defied classification according to any known taxonomy of warp phenomena. It was not quite a demon prince, not quite a manifestation of chaos undivided, but something entirely new that had been born from the unique conditions of prolonged siege warfare. The being had begun to influence events, not to favor one side or the other, but to ensure the siege's continuation regardless of cost. Rogel Dawn manifested for the first time in decades as something approaching his original form, his distributed consciousness coalescing into physical presence when the threat became too great to ignore. The reunion with his brother Perturabo took place in the same neutral zone where their subordinates had been conducting negotiations, but the meeting between the two Primarchs carried implications that transcended military strategy. "We have built something that has outgrown our ability to control it," Dawn admitted as he stood face to face with the brother who had been his bitter rival for nearly a century. "The siege was meant to serve our purposes, but we have become servants of its continuation. We created a perfect war machine, and now it seeks to operate independently of our will." Perturabo's response reflected the cold analysis that had always marked his approach to warfare. But for the first time in decades, his calculations included variables that transcended purely military considerations. The entity that feeds on our conflict has grown beyond parasitism into something approaching symbiosis. It preserves us not out of benevolence, but because our destruction would end the source of its sustenance. We have become livestock for something we never intended to create. The temporary alliance between the two Primarchs began as a purely tactical arrangement, but evolved into something that challenged the fundamental assumptions on which the siege had been based. They shared intelligence about supernatural phenomena that both sides had been experiencing, coordinated responses to warp incursions that threatened all participants equally, and began to develop strategies for ending a conflict that had become larger than either of their original purposes. The negotiations between the Emperor and Horus represented perhaps the most significant development in the siege's entire history. The two beings who had once been father and son but had become archetypal embodiments of order and rebellion found themselves forced to communicate directly for the first time since the conflict's early phases. Their confrontation took place not in physical space, but within the realm of pure concept, where their transformed natures could interact without the limitations imposed by material reality. What passed between them during those exchanges was recorded only in fragments, transmitted through psychic emanations that few minds could fully interpret. Yet the essence of their communication was clear. Both recognized that their personal conflict had been superseded by a threat that endangered everything they had originally sought to preserve or conquer. "We are no longer the beings who began this war." The Emperor's voice resonated through dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time, carrying meanings that transcended the limitations of human language. "We have become symbols of principles that no longer serve the purposes for which they were created. The time has come to choose between continuation of our conflict and preservation of what remains of reality." Horus's response carried the weight of recognition that his rebellion had achieved consequences far beyond anything he had originally intended. The gods of chaos whisper that eternal war is the universe's natural state, but even they fear what we have created here. Our siege has spawned something that threatens their dominion as much as yours. Perhaps ending our conflict serves a higher purpose than either of us originally understood. The decision to end the siege through controlled mutual withdrawal required innovations in diplomacy that had no precedent in human history. The third generation of siege-born leaders found themselves negotiating not just the terms of ceasefire, but the fundamental restructuring of reality around Terra to prevent the entity they had inadvertently created from surviving their conflict's conclusion. Marshal General Elena Vasquez led the technical teams that designed protocols for dismantling 90 years of accumulated siege infrastructure while maintaining the delicate balance of forces that prevented the warp entity from achieving independent existence. The process required precise coordination between former enemies who had to trust each other with information that could have been used to achieve decisive victory if the old patterns of warfare had been maintained. "We are not ending a war, but performing surgery on reality itself," Elena explained to assembled commanders from both sides during planning sessions that would have been unthinkable when the siege began. Every fortress dismantled, every weapon deactivated, every soldier withdrawn must be calculated to prevent the entity from achieving the critical mass needed for independent existence. Yet even as the formal leadership of both sides moved toward resolution, the chaos powers that had fed on the siege for 9 decades made desperate attempts to perpetuate the conflict through any means available. Demon princes that had grown fat on the endless violence manifested directly in the material realm, seeking to possess key commanders and restart hostilities before the withdrawal could be completed. The resistance came not just from supernatural sources, but from among the siege participants themselves. Warriors who had known no life except eternal conflict found the prospect of peace more terrifying than continued warfare. Siege cults that had developed religions based on the sanctity of endless struggle denounced the proposed withdrawal as the ultimate heresy against humanity's true nature. High cultist Sarah Mendoza led the most significant resistance to the peace negotiations, marshalling followers from both loyalist and traitor factions who believed that ending the siege would destroy the spiritual foundation upon which their civilization had been built. Her sermons, broadcast through the communication networks that connected the entire siege zone, challenged the authority of commanders who would abandon the sacred duty of eternal vigilance. They would trade our perfection for the lie of peace, Mendoza declared to congregations that numbered in the millions across both sides of the conflict. We have achieved something unprecedented in human history, a society based entirely on truth rather than comfortable illusion. To end the siege is to deny what we have become and return to the falsehood of believing that peace is possible. The cult's resistance required military action that violated every protocol that had been established for the siege's conclusion. Former enemies found themselves fighting alongside each other against opponents who represented the most dedicated believers in the system both sides were trying to dismantle. The irony was not lost on commanders who had to wage war in order to end war. Brother Captain Lysander of the Imperial Fists led joint operations with Iron Warriors who had been his enemies for 9 decades, their combined forces working to suppress uprising among those who refused to accept that the siege could end. The fighting was brutal precisely because it was conducted by combatants who understood each other's tactics with the intimacy that came from decades of opposition. We fight against ourselves, Lysander observed, as he coordinated with Iron Warriors Sergeant Kroger to suppress cultist positions in disputed sectors. These are not traitors or loyalists, but the purest products of what our siege created. They represent what we all might have become if we had not recognized the need to stop. The preparation for the final battle required both sides to develop tactics that had never been attempted in military history. They had to coordinate a conflict that was designed to be conclusive rather than continuing, to create a resolution that would satisfy the psychological needs of populations that had never known peace, while simultaneously denying the warp entity the emotional energy it required for survival. The battle plan that emerged from these negotiations was as much psychological warfare as military strategy. The final engagement would provide cathartic release for 90 years of accumulated tension while being carefully choreographed to avoid creating the conditions that would allow the siege's supernatural aspects to survive its formal conclusion. Technical adept Marcus Dawn, descendant of the Imperial Fists Primarch, led research teams that developed weapons specifically designed to harm entities that existed primarily as accumulated emotional resonance. These devices drew power not from conventional sources, but from the controlled release of feelings that had been suppressed during decades of siege warfare. We will fight one last battle, not to achieve victory, but to achieve ending. Marcus explained to weapons teams that included both human engineers and artificial intelligences that had evolved from the siege's data networks. Our ammunition will be the concentrated essence of 90 years of suppressed grief, exhaustion, and longing for peace. We will weaponize our own desire for the siege to end. The Emperor's final withdrawal from active participation in the material realm marked the beginning of the siege's end phase. His consciousness expanded far beyond its original limitations through 90 years of divine evolution, began the process of separating itself from the accumulated supernatural energy that had sustained the conflict for so long. Yet his withdrawal was not abandonment, but transformation. The Emperor's essence became distributed throughout Terra's substrate, creating a foundation of will and purpose that would outlast the siege itself. He was ensuring that whatever emerged from the conflict's conclusion would carry forward the best elements of what humanity had learned during its longest war. Malcador the Sigillite found himself serving as the final interpreter between the Emperor's transformed consciousness and the merely human administrators who would inherit whatever remained of imperial authority after the siege's conclusion. His own psychic abilities, enhanced by decades of proximity to divine power, allowed him to translate concepts that transcended normal human understanding into practical instructions for governance. The Emperor prepares for what lies beyond the siege, Malcador explained to civilian leaders who would face the unprecedented challenge of managing populations that had known only war for 4 generations. His transformation ensures that the lessons learned during 90 years of siege will not be lost when peace returns, assuming peace is something our people can still learn to embrace. The final phase of preparation required both sides to confront the psychological reality that ending the siege would transform their civilizations as fundamentally as beginning it had. They were preparing to destroy not just a military conflict, but an entire way of life that had defined human existence for nearly a century. The consensus that emerged from these preparations was unprecedented in human history. Former enemies united not by shared victory, but by shared recognition that some conflicts grew too large to serve any purpose except their own continuation. The siege had become perfect in its own terms, but perfection that served no purpose beyond itself was ultimately meaningless. As the final battle approached, both sides understood that they were not fighting to win, but to end. Not to achieve victory, but to achieve closure. The greatest war in human history would conclude not with triumph, but with the recognition that some forms of success were indistinguishable from failure, and that wisdom sometimes meant choosing to lose rather than winning at costs that no victory could justify. 100 years after it began, the siege ended not with the thunder of victory, but with the quiet recognition that some conflicts grow too large to serve any purpose except their own continuation. The final battle between father and son took place not on the blood-soaked decks of the vengeful spirit, but in a realm of pure concept where beings who had transcended mortality could confront the consequences of what their war had created. What passed between them in that ultimate confrontation was witnessed by none, yet its resolution echoed through every level of reality where their conflict had taken root. The Emperor and Horus met as equals for the first time since the rebellion began, their individual wills tempered by a century of warfare that had transformed them both beyond recognition. Neither was the being who had initiated the conflict, and both understood that their personal struggle had become secondary to larger questions about the nature of existence itself. The resolution they achieved was not victory for either side, but acknowledgement that their opposition had served purposes neither had originally intended. We are no longer father and son. The Emperor's voice resonated through dimensions that existed beyond normal space-time, carrying meanings that transcended the limitations of human language. We have become principles in opposition, forces whose conflict has shaped reality according to patterns we never chose. The question is whether ending our war serves any purpose beyond ending itself. Horus's response carried the weight of recognition that his rebellion had achieved consequences far beyond anything he had originally sought. I sought to prove that you were wrong about humanity's destiny. Instead, I have helped create a humanity that neither of us would recognize. Perhaps that transformation was the true victory, regardless of which of us claims it. The agreement they reached was not peace in any conventional sense, but a mutual decision to cease their opposition and allow the forces they had unleashed to find their own resolution. Both understood that their withdrawal from active conflict would not immediately end the siege, but it would remove the supernatural energy that had sustained it beyond all reasonable limits. The controlled demolition of Perturabo's siege works began at dawn on the first day of the new century, though dawn and dusk had long since become arbitrary divisions in Terra's transformed atmosphere. The iron ring that had held Terra captive for 100 years was dismantled with the same methodical precision that had marked its construction, each fortress station carefully deactivated to prevent the psychological shock of sudden freedom from driving the siege's survivors into madness. Perturabo oversaw the destruction of his greatest creation with the same analytical detachment he had shown during its construction. The Iron Warrior's Primarch had become so integrated with his siege works that their dismantling required him to surrender aspects of his own consciousness that had been distributed throughout the orbital network. Yet he approached this self-dissolution with the satisfaction of an architect whose masterpiece had fulfilled its purpose. Perfect things are meant to be temporary, Perturabo observed, as he watched the final fortress station power down its weapons for the last time. I built the perfect siege, and now I am privileged to witness its perfect ending. Few engineers are granted such completeness in their work. Rogel Dawn experienced a similar transformation as Terra's defensive systems were gradually deactivated. The Imperial Fist's Primarch had spent a century becoming one with his fortifications, and their peaceful decommissioning required him to rediscover what individual identity meant after decades of existing as distributed consciousness. The process was neither painful nor joyful, but carried the strange satisfaction of completion after unimaginable effort. The evacuation of siege-borne populations represented perhaps the greatest logistical challenge in human history. Millions of people who had never known any life except siege warfare had to be relocated to environments where peace was not just possible but expected. The psychological adjustment required was so profound that many chose to remain within Terra's walls rather than venture into a galaxy they could not comprehend. Colonel General Marcus Thorne led the evacuation efforts with the same efficiency he had brought to siege warfare, but the challenges were unlike anything military doctrine had ever anticipated. His forces had to transport not just people, but entire ways of life that had evolved in isolation for 4 generations. They were moving civilizations as much as populations. "We are evacuating ourselves," Thorne observed, as he watched transport ships carry away families who spoke languages that had developed during the siege and practiced customs that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. These people are not returning to anything that previously existed. They are being born into a universe that has never seen their like before. Elena Vasquez chose to remain on Terra, accepting appointment as the first Governor-General of the post-siege world. Her responsibilities included overseeing the transformation of a planet that had been organized entirely around principles of permanent warfare into something that could function in peacetime. The task would take generations to complete, assuming it could be completed at all. Terra will never be what it was before the siege, Elena admitted during her inaugural address to assembled populations that included both human survivors and artificial intelligences that had evolved during the conflict. We must discover what Terra can become now that the war has ended. We are explorers in our own homeland, pioneers in a territory that happens to bear the name of humanity's birthworld. The transformation of the Imperium beyond Terra proved equally challenging. A galaxy that had been shaped by a century of siege warfare could not simply return to pre-conflict patterns of governance and culture. The administrative structures that had evolved to support a besieged homeworld had to be adapted to manage an empire where the siege mentality had become the default approach to every challenge. Malcador the Sigillite found himself serving as regent for an imperium that no longer resembled the vision that had inspired the Great Crusade. His responsibilities included integrating siege-born populations into worlds that had never experienced such intensity of conflict, managing technologies that had been developed under impossible conditions, and creating new forms of governance that could accommodate people who understood authority only through the lens of military necessity. We have inherited an empire shaped by war, governed by warriors, and populated by people who know no reality except struggle, Malcador explained to planetary governors who were struggling to adapt to refugees whose very presence challenged their understanding of human nature. The siege has ended, but its influence will shape the Imperium for millennia to come. Sanguinius emerged from the siege's conclusion as perhaps the most changed of all the surviving Primarchs. The Angel's noble nature had been fundamentally altered by a century of violence, leaving him with insights into the darker aspects of human nature that his original innocence could never have achieved. He accepted responsibility for leading the integration efforts, using his understanding of both sides of human nature to bridge the gap between siege-born populations and those who had never experienced such extremity. We must learn to be human again, Sanguinius declared to audiences that included both normal imperial citizens and siege survivors whose genetic modifications made them barely recognizable as members of the same species. Yet we cannot simply forget what the siege taught us about our capacity for endurance, adaptation, and sacrifice. We must become something new that incorporates both our innocence and our experience. The technologies that had been developed during the siege proved to have applications that extended far beyond warfare. The recycling systems that had sustained Terra's population for a century became the foundation for closed-loop manufacturing that revolutionized industrial production throughout the galaxy. The psychological techniques that had maintained sanity under impossible conditions were adapted for use in exploration missions that would take humans into environments as challenging as the siege zone had been. Master Engineer Marcus Dawn led research teams that adapted siege technologies for peaceful applications, but the work required fundamental reconceptualization of devices that had been designed with no purpose except survival under hostile conditions. The challenge was not just technical, but philosophical: how to transform tools of endurance into instruments of growth. Our machines were built to help us survive, Marcus explained to civilian engineers who were struggling to understand technologies that seemed to operate according to principles that transcended normal physics. Now we must teach them to help us live. The transition from survival to life is more complex than anyone who has not experienced siege conditions can understand. Yet the most profound change was in the people themselves. A century of siege warfare had created human subspecies that were adapted to conditions that no longer existed. Their enhanced immune systems, modified metabolisms, and altered psychological structures made them extraordinarily capable in crisis situations, but poorly suited to the mundane requirements of peaceful existence. Dr. Sarah Kane, daughter of the commander who had led civilian evacuations during the siege, established research institutes dedicated to understanding how siege-borne populations could be integrated into normal society without losing the adaptations that represented humanity's greatest evolutionary achievement. Her work focused on preserving beneficial modifications while helping people adjust to environments where such capabilities were not required for survival. The siege created a new form of human being, Dr. Caney observed in research reports, that would influence imperial policy for centuries to come. These people represent our species' capacity for adaptation under the most extreme conditions imaginable. To lose what they have learned would be to waste the greatest lesson humanity has ever taught itself about its own potential. The question of whether the siege had truly ended or merely transformed remained unanswered as the first post-siege decade progressed. While the physical conflict had ceased, its psychological and cultural effects continued to influence every aspect of life throughout the Imperium. Veterans of the siege found themselves serving as advisors, leaders, and teachers in situations that required the kind of endurance and adaptability that only they possessed. The siege cults that had worshipped eternal conflict adapted their doctrines to celebrate the struggle for peaceful reconstruction. They argued that the challenge of learning to live without war was simply another form of warfare, requiring the same dedication and sacrifice that had sustained their ancestors through a century of violence. Their influence grew rather than diminished, as populations throughout the galaxy found meaning in their message that struggle was the essential element of human existence. High cultist Sarah Mendoza, now ancient beyond her apparent years due to exposure to temporal anomalies during the siege's supernatural phases, continued to preach the gospel of necessary conflict. Her sermons were broadcast throughout the former siege zone and beyond, reaching audiences who had never experienced siege warfare, but found resonance in her message that peace was only meaningful when it was continuously earned through effort. The siege taught us that struggle is not the enemy of happiness, but its foundation, Mendoza declared to congregations that numbered in the billions across multiple worlds. We do not fight because we enjoy suffering, but because through struggle we become worthy of whatever joy we are capable of achieving. The siege has ended, but the need for worthy opposition continues. Perhaps the most significant development was the recognition that the siege had created precedents for human organization that would influence the species' development for millennia to come. The technologies, social structures, and psychological adaptations that had emerged from a century of siege warfare provided templates for how humanity might respond to future challenges that would test the species' capacity for survival. The records maintained by the siege chroniclers became the foundation for new forms of education that prepared students for challenges that might not emerge for generations. The assumption was that humanity would face future crises that would require the same kind of total adaptation that the siege had demanded, and that preparation for such challenges should begin long before they materialized. Master Chronicler David Torr, now responsible for preserving the siege's lessons for posterity, established archives that would ensure the knowledge gained through a century of warfare would not be lost during whatever peace humanity might achieve. His work focused on extracting practical wisdom from experiences that had pushed human endurance beyond all previously known limits. We survived something that should have destroyed us, Tor observed in writings that would be studied for millennia throughout the Imperium and beyond. The question is not whether we can survive future challenges of similar magnitude, but whether we can apply what we learned during the siege to create conditions where such extremity is never again necessary. As the first century after the siege's end approached, surveys were conducted throughout the former conflict zone to assess the long-term effects of humanity's longest war. The results were both encouraging and troubling, suggesting that while the siege had ended, its influence had become a permanent part of human nature that would shape the species' development indefinitely. The surveys revealed that siege-borne populations had developed capabilities that remained stable across generations, suggesting that the adaptations achieved during the conflict had become inheritable traits. Children born decades after the siege's end retained enhanced immune systems, modified stress responses, and psychological structures that made them extraordinarily resilient in crisis situations. Yet these same adaptations made peace feel artificial and temporary to populations that had evolved under conditions of permanent threat. The former siege zone experienced higher rates of voluntary military service, technological innovation, and social experimentation than any other region of the Imperium, as if its people were unconsciously preparing for challenges that might never come. The Emperor, now permanently withdrawn to a realm of pure consciousness that intersected with material reality only at moments of absolute necessity, observed these developments with satisfaction that transcended his original purposes. The siege had achieved something he had never intended, but had come to recognize as superior to his initial goals for humanity's evolution. From his perspective beyond normal time and space, the Emperor could see the siege's influence spreading throughout the galaxy as its veterans carried their hard-won wisdom to worlds that had never experienced such extremity. The principles they taught, the technologies they developed, and the social structures they created were becoming the foundation for a form of human civilization that could survive challenges that would have destroyed their ancestors. The ambiguity of the siege's ending remained its most defining characteristic. While the physical conflict had ceased, its psychological and cultural effects continued to influence every aspect of human existence. The question of whether peace had been achieved or war had simply transformed into more subtle forms resisted easy answers. Veterans of the siege often reported dreams of conflict that felt more real than their waking lives. They described experiencing phantom sensations of artillery fire, temporal displacement events that seemed to connect them to battles that had occurred decades in the past, and brief moments of clarity that suggested the siege continued on levels of reality that normal consciousness could not access. Children born after the siege's end sometimes displayed knowledge of siege tactics, defensive architecture, and resource management that they could not have learned through conventional education. Their play often involved elaborate games that recreated siege scenarios with accuracy that troubled their parents and teachers. The possibility that the siege had not truly ended, but had simply moved beyond the reach of normal perception, was discussed by philosophers, theologians, and scientists throughout the Imperium. Some argued that conflicts of such magnitude and duration achieved a form of permanence that transcended the physical circumstances that had given them birth. In the deepest levels of the former imperial palace, now converted to research facilities and archives, sensors occasionally detected energy patterns that resembled the signatures of siege-related temporal anomalies. These events were brief and subtle, but their persistence suggested that something of the siege's supernatural aspects remained active beneath the surface of apparent normalcy. The final entry in the official siege chronicles was written by David Tor on the exact centennial of the conflict's formal conclusion. His words captured the essential ambiguity of an ending that felt more like transformation than resolution. The siege has ended, yet continues. Peace has been achieved, yet war remains our fundamental condition. We have returned to normalcy, yet normalcy itself has been forever changed by what we experienced during the century of walls. Whether we have achieved victory or merely learned to live with eternal defeat, only time will decide. There is no end to the lessons the siege taught us. There is only the application of those lessons to challenges that have not yet revealed themselves. The war is over. The war has only begun.